Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I worked the late shift at the diner that night. It was past midnight by the time I locked up and walked to my car. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of cars near the back. The streetlights flickered. I remember the detail because I glanced up at them when I got to my car, wondering if the city ever planned to fix them. I unlocked the door and got in, tossing my bag onto the passenger seat. I was exhausted. My feet hurt. I just wanted to go home, shower, and sleep. The car was cold when I started it. I turned on the heat and pulled out of the lot. The roads were quiet. Not many cars out at that hour. I lived about 15 minutes away, mostly highway, a few dark streets before my building. I didn't think about anything while driving. Just went through the motions. I remember stopping at a red light, drumming my fingers on the wheel, staring at the empty road ahead. Then, I saw it. In the rearview mirror. A shape, barely visible in the dim light. A man. Lying down across the back seat. I froze. My breath stopped. My hands locked on the wheel. My mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Just a dark outline, but I could see the rise and fall of his chest. He was breathing. I kept my eyes forward, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I couldn't think. My body wanted to react, slam the brakes, jump out, but I knew that would be worse. The light turned green. I pressed the gas. I felt every movement behind me, imagined him shifting, getting ready to sit up, grab me. But he didn't. He just lay there, breathing. I needed to get out. I forced myself to stay calm, to drive normal. If he didn't know I saw him, maybe I had a chance. My phone was in my bag. I couldn't reach it. I couldn't call for help. I spotted a gas station up ahead. Bright lights. A couple of cars parked near the pumps. I slowed down, flicked my turn signal, pulled in. The moment I stopped, I threw the door open and jumped out. I ran. Not to the station, not to anyone. Just away. I turned back after a few steps, expecting to see him getting out, chasing me. But the car door didn't open. I stood there, panting, shaking, staring at my car. Nothing. A man near the pumps looked over, confused. I forced myself to move, walked toward the station, trying to seem normal. Inside, I went straight to the cashier. "There's someone in my car," I whispered. The cashier frowned. "What?" "There's a man in my back seat." His eyes widened. He glanced out the window. "Are you sure?" I nodded. He reached under the counter, grabbed something I thought a weapon, but it was just his phone. He stepped around the counter, walked toward the door, peered out. "Stay here," he said. I didn't. I followed him, keeping my distance. He moved slowly, approached my car from the side, then stopped. I saw him tense up. Then, he yanked the back door open. Empty. He turned to me, confused. "No one's here." I shook my head, stepping closer. No, he was there. I saw him. The seats were empty. Nothing but my work jacket, crumpled in the corner. I stared, my whole body cold. I swear, I whispered. The cashier sighed. You sure you weren't just tired? Maybe. I know what I saw. He didn't argue. Just nodded. Maybe check your locks, just in case. I did. All locked. No sign of forced entry. I didn't know what to do. I felt sick. Like I was losing my mind. The cashier waited, watching me. You want me to call someone? I shook my head. No, it's fine. He hesitated but didn't push. I got back in my car. Checked the back seat 3 more times before locking the doors. I drove home with my stomach twisted, my skin crawling. The feeling didn't leave. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked my car in daylight. Nothing there. No signs. No proof. But I knew someone had been in my car. We booked the place for a quiet weekend. It was an old house out in the countryside with big windows and a long gravel driveway. The pictures made it look nice: modern kitchen, big living room, cozy bedroom. Secluded, peaceful. That was what we wanted. Just a break from everything. We got there late Friday evening. The host left the key in a lockbox by the door. The house was just like the photos. Clean, simple, nothing weird. The only thing that stood out was the attic hatch in the hallway. It was one of those square pull-down doors with a string hanging from it. I didn't think about it at first. Just another part of the house. That first night was normal. We cooked, watched a movie, went to bed. The house made noises, but it was old. Creaking wood, wind against the windows. Nothing unusual. The second night, we heard footsteps. It was late. We were in bed, half asleep. Then slow, deliberate steps right above us. I opened my eyes. My girlfriend, Mia, stiffened beside me. We both heard it. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. Someone moving. I sat up, listening. The sound stopped. The ceiling was quiet. Mia whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded. We stayed still for a long time, waiting, but there was nothing else. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it was nothing. Maybe an animal on the roof. Maybe the owl shifting. We went back to sleep. But in the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling. The sound had been too clear. Too human. After breakfast, I checked the attic hatch. Pulled the string. It was locked. I pushed on it solid, didn't budge. Maybe it was nothing after all. That night, we heard it again. Louder this time. Mia gripped my arm. "That's not the house," she whispered. The steps moved. Slow, deliberate. Like someone shifting their weight carefully, trying not to be heard. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. My heart was hammering. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight. The second I stepped into the hallway, the sound stopped. I looked up at the attic hatch. The string swayed slightly. I stood there, holding my breath. My skin felt too tight, my body telling me to run. But I had to know. I reached up, pulled. The hatch didn't move. Still locked. I exhaled, relieved. But then I noticed something else. A small draft of cold air coming from the wall. I turned, shining my light along the hallway. And then I saw it. A crack. Near the baseboard, just beside the attic hatch. A thin, vertical line in the wall. Almost invisible in the dim light. I stepped closer, running my fingers along it. Wood. A seam. A door. Mia came up behind me. What is that? I don't know. I searched the edges, found a small gap near the bottom. No handle. Just a panel, cut to blend into the wall. I pressed. Nothing. Then I tried pulling at the gap. The panel shifted. It wasn't locked. Just stuck from years of not being used. I pulled harder. The door groaned open. Behind it, darkness. A narrow space, barely 2 feet wide, disappearing into the walls. The air smelled stale, like dust and sweat. I shined my phone inside. My stomach turned. Wrappers. Empty bags of chips. A plastic water bottle. A dirty sleeping bag crumpled in the corner. Someone had been living here. I took a step back, my mind racing. The space was small, just a crawl space between the walls. But it ran deep. Far enough that I couldn't see the end. Mia whispered, "We need to leave." I nodded. We grabbed our bags, keys, everything, and left without looking back. I didn't care if we left things behind. I just needed to get out. As we drove away, Mia checked the Airbnb listing. The reviews were good. No mentions of anything strange. But then she found it the only negative review. 1 star. No comment. Just a single photo attached. A picture of the attic hatch. The string hanging down. And right behind it, barely visible in the shadows, a face. I was just looking to kill some time. I'd been on the road for work all week, and after a long drive, I didn't feel like sitting in a silent hotel room. The bar was a small place, nothing fancy. Low lighting, a few groups of people scattered around, quiet music playing. I got a beer and found a stool near the end of the counter. At first, I wasn't paying much attention to anyone around me. I just wanted to unwind, maybe watch the game on the TV above the bar. But after a few minutes, the guy next to me spoke. "Long drive?" he asked. I glanced at him. Mid-40s, maybe older, clean-shaven, wearing a plain button-down shirt. Nothing stood out about him. Just an average guy. "Yeah," I said. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. "Work trip?" I hesitated for half a second. Then I nodded. That should have been the end of it. Just small talk. But he kept going. "Bet you're staying at that Holiday Inn up the road. Closest hotel to the highway." That caught my attention. I hadn't mentioned where I was staying. I looked at him a little closer. Maybe I'd seen him before. Maybe he worked at the hotel. "How'd you guess?" I asked. He smiled. "Lucky guess." That should have set off alarms in my head. But I was tired. I told myself it wasn't weird. Just a common guess. I went back to my drink. The guy took a sip of his and stared at the TV for a while. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You've had that truck for, what, 5 years now?" I felt my body go still. I turned to him. "What?" "The truck," he said, motioning toward the window. My truck was parked right outside. "You've had it a while." I didn't answer. My throat felt tight. "Got it in 19, right?" Down in, he paused, like he was trying to recall something. "Birmingham?" My stomach dropped. I wasn't from Birmingham, but I had driven down there to buy the truck off a guy selling it online. That wasn't something a stranger should know. I tried to laugh it off. "Do I know you?" He smiled again, but there was something off about it this time. "Nah, we've never met." I didn't like this. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check a message. The screen was blank, but I needed a second to think. I glanced at the bartender. She wasn't paying attention to us. The man leaned in slightly. "Last time you were in a place like this, you had whiskey. What changed?" My heart started pounding. The last time I sat alone at a bar, I had ordered whiskey. That was months ago. In a different state. I pushed my drink away. "I think I'm gonna head out." The man nodded, like he already knew I'd say that. I stood up and reached for my wallet. The bartender was still busy, so I left a 20 on the counter. I turned to leave. The man said one last thing. "Careful driving back. That left turn out of the lot can be tricky at night." I walked out fast. I got into my truck and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I looked back at the bar. Through the window, I could see the man still sitting there, watching the TV like nothing had happened. I pulled out onto the road. My heart was racing. I drove straight to the hotel, parked under a streetlight, and sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But when I finally got out and walked toward the entrance, I stopped cold. There was a car parked a few spaces down. And that man, he was sitting in the driver's seat. Waiting. For me. I got off work later than usual that night. I remember being annoyed about it because I had planned to be home earlier, but things got backed up, and by the time I left, it was already past 11. I usually took the train, but I missed it by a minute, and I didn't feel like standing around in the station for another 20. I figured I'd just walk. It wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes, and I'd done it plenty of times before. The streets were quiet, but they always were at this hour. Just a few cars passing, the occasional person heading home. I was about halfway when I noticed him. I didn't see him right away. It was just this feeling, like something was off. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, maybe half a block behind me. Dark jacket, hands in his pockets, head down. He wasn't close, but something about him put me on edge. I kept walking. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was just another person trying to get home. A few steps later, I checked again. Still there. I turned down a different street, one I didn't usually take, just to see. When I glanced back, he had turned too. That was when I knew. I walked faster. My heart was pounding now, but I told myself not to panic. I wasn't far from my apartment. Just a few more minutes, and I'd be inside, door locked, safe. I took another turn. Then another. Each time, I checked behind me. He was always there. I wanted to run, but I didn't. I didn't want him to know I knew. I crossed the street. He did, too. I reached into my bag for my keys. My hands were shaking. I kept them curled in my fist. I turned down my street, almost home now. I could see my building at the end of the block. I took out my phone and dialed, not even thinking. I called my best friend. She answered on the second ring. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "Stay on the phone with me." She must have heard something in my voice because she didn't ask why. "What's wrong?" "There's a guy following me." I could hear her breathing pick up. "Where are you?" "Almost home," I said. I could hear her moving around. "Want me to call someone?" "No," I said quickly. I didn't know why I said it. Maybe because I didn't want to make it real. Maybe because I thought if I could just get inside, it would be over. I was close now. 30 feet. 20. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps speeding up behind me. I ran. I didn't look back. I ran straight to my building, my keys already in my hand. I jammed one into the lock, my whole body shaking, and shoved the door open. I turned, just for a second. He was standing at the curb, staring. The door slammed shut between us. I backed away, breathing hard. My friend was shouting through the phone, asking if I was okay. I looked through the glass. He was still there. Still watching. I ran up to my apartment and locked the door. For a long time, I stood there, listening. But I never heard footsteps walking away. We had been driving for hours, switching off every couple of stops. It was dark by the time we pulled off the highway. The gas station was small, one of those places that looked older than it probably was, the lights flickering in the cold air. It was the only place for miles, nothing but flat, empty road behind us. Sam was in the passenger seat, messing with her phone. She didn't look up when I put the car in park. "I'm gonna run in," I said, stretching my legs. She nodded. "Grab me a water?" I told her yeah, then got out. The air smelled like dust and gasoline. I glanced around the lot, one other car parked at the pump, nobody inside. A truck rumbled past on the highway, its lights disappearing into the night. The guy behind the counter barely looked at me. I grabbed a water and a Red Bull, paid in cash, and walked back out. I wasn't inside for more than 2 minutes. The second I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. The car was empty. I stopped, staring. The passenger door was shut. The seat was bare. I looked around the lot, expecting to see her standing off to the side, stretching, maybe smoking. She wasn't there. A weird feeling crawled up my spine. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called her. No answer. I walked to the car and yanked open the door. Her bag was gone. Her jacket, too. But the keys were still in the ignition, and her half-finished soda was in the cup holder. I checked the back seat. Nothing. I turned in a slow circle. The parking lot was empty. I ran to the gas station door and shoved it open so hard the bell nearly snapped off. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out too loud. "Did you see my friend come in?" The guy behind the counter looked up from his magazine. "What?" "My friend," I said, pointing toward my car. She was in the passenger seat. "Did she come in here?" He frowned. No one came in. I stared at him. He was lying. He had to be. Are you sure? She was sitting right there. He shrugged. Been quiet all night, man. Just you. The feeling in my stomach turned heavy. I walked back out, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I called her again. Straight to voicemail. I circled the car, looking under it, around it, behind the dumpster near the edge of the lot. Sam? I called. My voice echoed into the night. Nothing. I tried to think. If she left, where would she go? There was nothing out here. No houses, no side roads, no businesses. Just the highway stretching in both directions. I walked to the edge of the lot and looked down the road. Only darkness. I got back in the car, gripping the wheel hard enough to hurt. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. I texted her. Where are you? No response. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat beside me. Then I noticed something. The seat belt. It was still buckled. My stomach twisted. She had been wearing it when I left. If she got out, she would have unbuckled it. I reached over and ran my fingers along the strap. It was stretched tight, like it was still wrapped around something. Like someone had pulled it closed after she was already gone. My hands felt cold. I started the car and pulled out onto the road. I drove slow at first, scanning the sides of the highway, looking for any sign of her. I kept expecting my phone to ring, for her to tell me she just walked off for some stupid reason. It never did. I drove until I hit the next town. I went straight to the police station. I told them everything. They asked me the same questions over and over. Are you sure she was in the car when you stopped? Did she say anything strange before you went inside? Could she have gotten out and walked away? I told them no. They pulled the station security footage. It showed me pulling in. It showed me getting out of the car and walking inside. It showed the car sitting there, still, undisturbed. No one got out. No one walked away. But when I came back outside, she was gone. I had agreed to house sit for my friend Leah while she was out of town. It was a nice place, quiet neighborhood, 2-story house with big windows and a fenced-in yard. She had a dog, an older golden retriever named Milo, who needed company, and she offered to pay me. I didn't have any reason to say no. The first day was normal. I fed Milo, watched TV, scrolled on my phone. Before bed, I checked all the doors and made sure they were locked. I wasn't usually nervous about being alone, but the house felt too quiet. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar space. The second day, I decided to tidy up a little. Leah had asked me to check the mail and water a couple of plants. I was looking for a pen in one of the drawers in the kitchen when I found it. A folded piece of paper, pushed all the way to the back. I almost didn't read it. I thought it was a grocery list or something, but when I opened it, the handwriting was small and hurried. If you hear footsteps upstairs, leave immediately. I read it twice. Then a third time. I felt cold. I tried to tell myself it was a joke, something Leah wrote down and forgot about. Or maybe it wasn't hers at all, maybe the last tenant left it. But something about it felt wrong. I put it back and shut the drawer. The rest of the day, I tried not to think about it. I put on music, scrolled through my phone, took Milo for a long walk. But every time I passed the stairs, my eyes went up without meaning to. That night, I made sure all the doors were locked again. I even checked the windows, just in case. I tried to tell myself the note meant nothing. That it was a joke. That I was overthinking. Then, around 1 a.m, Milo lifted his head and let out a low whine. I froze. He was looking at the ceiling. I held my breath. And then I heard it. A soft creaking sound. Slow, steady. Someone moving. Upstairs. My stomach twisted so hard I thought I might throw up. I stayed still, listening. The sound didn't stop. A step. Then another. Right above me. I didn't move. I couldn't. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, trying to listen past the pounding in my chest. Milo let out another whimper and crawled closer to me, pressing against my legs. I felt sick. I reached for my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I didn't want to call 911 unless I was sure. Maybe the house was just settling. Maybe an animal got in somehow. Maybe I was just tired and hearing things. Then something else happened. A door upstairs opened. Not fast. Not a bang. Just a slow, tearful creak. I got up. I moved as quietly as I could to the front door. My legs felt weak. My hands were numb. I didn't even think to grab my bag or shoes. I unlocked the door. And then I heard something behind me. Not upstairs this time. The stairs. Someone was coming down. I yanked the door open and ran. Milo bolted after me. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the block. I turned back, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. The house was dark. The door was still open. I kept expecting to see someone step out. No one did. I called Leah. She picked up on the fourth ring, groggy and confused. I told her what happened. She went quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Get in your car. Don't go back inside. I'm calling the police." They checked the house. All the doors were still locked from the inside. All the windows were shut. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing stolen. Nothing out of place. Except for one thing. The attic hatch was open. There was a blanket up there. A plastic bottle of water. Food wrappers. And a knife. The police never found him. Whoever he was. I was driving home late from a work trip. The highway stretched dark and empty, just me and the occasional truck in the distance. I had been on the road for hours, trying to keep my eyes open, waiting for the next gas station to stop and grab some coffee. My phone was almost dead, but I had the GPS voice guiding me through the speaker. I knew I had maybe another 40 minutes before I hit my turnoff. Then I saw the red and blue lights in my mirror. My stomach dropped. I hadn't been speeding. I wasn't swerving. I didn't even think I had a taillight out. But there they were, flashing behind me, and I had no choice but to slow down and pull over. I put my hazards on and pulled onto the shoulder. The car behind me stopped, and the lights kept flashing. I reached for my wallet, my fingers stiff. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was just the late hour making me paranoid. I watched in the mirror as the officer got out of the car. The uniform wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but as he got closer, I saw it. The shirt was too dark, almost black, instead of the usual navy. The pants didn't have a stripe. And the belt, there was no radio, no handcuffs, nothing but a holster. No badge. My mouth went dry. I kept my hands on the wheel, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was some kind of special division. Maybe an off-duty cop helping with traffic stops. But the closer he got, the worse it felt. His face was wrong. Not in a deformed way, not in an obvious way. Just blank. No expression. Like he wasn't used to making normal human faces. His walk was off too, stiff, like someone imitating the way an officer should move. He tapped on my window. I didn't roll it down. He didn't react to that, just motioned for me to lower it. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear anything over the highway noise. I cracked the window an inch. License and registration. His voice was flat. No accent, no inflection. I didn't move. Can I see some ID? I asked. For the first time, he hesitated. It was small, just half a second, but I caught it. You were driving erratically, he said instead. Step out of the vehicle. That's when I knew. Real cops don't ask you to step out unless something is seriously wrong. Not for a simple traffic stop. I swallowed, gripping the wheel. Why? I asked. He didn't answer right away. His fingers flexed at his sides, like he was irritated I wasn't cooperating. You need to come with me, he said. Now. My heartbeat slammed in my ears. I glanced at the dashboard. My phone was dead. No way to call for help. No other cars on the road. Just darkness stretching out on both sides, trees and fields and nothing else. I forced myself to think. Can I call your department? I asked. Just to confirm. His face twitched. The first real expression he'd made. Then he reached for the door handle. I locked the doors. His hand stopped. Rested there for a second. Then he straightened, took a step back. I need you to exit the vehicle, he repeated. His voice was flatter now. Mechanical. I shook my head. He stared at me through the glass. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back to his car. I didn't move. My breath was shallow, my hands hurt from gripping the wheel. My whole body screamed at me to go. The moment he reached his car, I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched as I shot forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look back. I didn't care if I was speeding. I just drove. And then the headlights behind me turned off. Not like he turned around. Not like he was left behind. Just gone. Like he was never there at all. I drove straight to the nearest gas station. Parked right under the lights. Grabbed my phone and plugged it in, waiting for it to turn back on. When it finally did, I called 911. The dispatcher listened, calm, professional. When I gave her the mile marker, she asked me to repeat it. Then she got quiet. There's no officer assigned to that area tonight, she said. I sat there, my skin cold. I asked if any off-duty officers might have been driving through. She said no. I asked if any vehicles matching that description were registered to the department. She said no. Then she asked me something that made my stomach drop. Did he touch your car? I thought about the door handle, the way his fingers had rested there, just for a second. Yes, I whispered. She told me not to go home. She told me to check my car before I drove anywhere. I got out slowly, my hands shaking, and circled around. Under the door handle, there was something small. A piece of tape. I peeled it off, and a tiny, almost invisible wire came with it. A tracker. Someone had been planning to follow me. I run the same route every morning. It's always quiet that early, the street's still dark, only a few other joggers or dog walkers around. I like it that way. Peaceful. That morning, I was about 20 minutes in, heading down a stretch of road that ran past an empty lot. No houses, no businesses, just a chain link fence and cracked pavement. I saw the van before I heard it. An old white one, the kind with no windows on the sides. It was pulled over a little ahead of me, idling. The driver's window was down. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. As I got closer, the driver leaned out a little. A man, maybe mid-40s, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, even though the sun wasn't up yet. He waved me down. "Hey, miss, can I ask you something?" I slowed a little, but I didn't stop. Just shook my head and kept jogging. "Sorry, I'm lost," he said. His voice was light, casual. "I'm looking for River Street. My phone's dead." River Street was a few blocks over. Close enough that I almost answered. But something about his tone felt off. Too friendly. I took another step, and that's when I heard it. The click of a door handle. The side door. I turned my head just in time to see it sliding open. Someone inside. A man, crouched low, dressed in dark clothes. His hand shot out toward me. I jumped back. His fingers grazed my arm, but I yanked it away and staggered back. My foot hit the curb, and I almost fell. The driver shouted something, but I wasn't listening. I ran. Not back the way I came, but across the street, cutting through an empty lot, my breath tearing out of me in gasps. I heard the van's engine right behind me. They were turning around. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the nearest intersection. There were houses there, streetlights, cars parked along the curb. People. I didn't stop running until I was at someone's front door, pounding on it. Lights flicked on inside. A dog barked. I turned. The van was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking. The homeowner, a middle-aged woman in a robe, opened the door, alarmed. I told her what happened, my words stumbling over each other. She called the police. They took my statement, asked me for details. I gave them everything I could, but it wasn't much. No license plate. No clear look at the guy in the back. Just a white van, an average-looking man in a cap. They said they patrol the area. Check security cameras. I don't know if they ever found them. I changed my route after that. Bought pepper spray. But I still think about that moment, the second I heard the door slide open. 1 second slower, and I wouldn't be here. I got to the hotel just after midnight. My flight had been delayed, and I was exhausted. I just wanted a shower and a few hours of sleep before my morning meeting. The guy at the front desk barely looked at me. He slid the key card across the counter, mumbled the room number, and went back to his computer. The elevator ride was silent. The hallway on my floor was empty, the kind of empty that made my footsteps sound too loud against the carpet. The air felt stale, like the floor hadn't been aired out in days. Room 724. I slid the key card in, and the lock clicked. The door swung open, and before I even stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The room wasn't empty. A suitcase sat open on the floor by the bed. Clothes, half folded, spilled out of it. A phone charger was plugged into the wall. The bathroom light was on, the door half open. And then I heard it. A ringing. I turned my head. A phone, an old flip phone, sat on the nightstand, vibrating against the wood. I didn't move. I just stood there, holding my own bag, staring at that phone like it might explode. No one was supposed to be here. The ringing stopped. I exhaled. Then it started again. Louder this time, or maybe it just felt that way because the room was dead silent except for that sound. I took a step back, gripping the door handle. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe the front desk double-booked a room. Maybe someone checked in earlier and left in a hurry. But if they left, why was their phone still here? I looked at the bathroom door again. The light buzzed softly. The door was open just enough that I couldn't see inside. I leaned my head in, listening. Nothing. The phone stopped ringing again. I swallowed hard and took a step into the room. Slow, careful. I reached out and flicked the main light switch. The overhead lights flickered once before humming to life. No one. The bed was unmade. The pillows looked recently slept on. There was a jacket draped over the desk chair, a watch sitting next to the TV remote. Whoever was staying here, they hadn't planned on leaving. The phone rang again. I jumped. It was still sitting on the nightstand, vibrating against the wood, rattling a little. I don't know why I reached for it. My hand moved on its own, fingers closing around the plastic. I hesitated, then flipped it open. I didn't say anything. Neither did the person on the other end. But I heard breathing. Slow. Controlled. Like someone was listening. I waited. My heart pounded against my ribs. Then, just before I could say something, the line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. My fingers were shaking. I dropped it back onto the nightstand and turned toward the door. I was leaving. I didn't care if I had to sleep in my rental car. But just as I took a step forward, the bathroom door creaked. Not much. Just an inch. Enough that I knew, without a doubt, someone was behind it. I couldn't move. The air in the room changed. Like whoever was in there knew I had figured it out. My knees locked. My fingers clenched into fists. My ears rang with the sound of my own pulse. Then, the phone rang again. That was enough. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I nearly slammed into the elevator, jabbing the button so hard my nail bent back. The door slid open, and I jumped inside, hitting the lobby button over and over until they finally closed. When I reached the front desk, I didn't bother lowering my voice. There's someone in my room. The guy behind the counter looked up, confused. What? There's someone in my room. 724. There's a suitcase, a phone. I swallowed, my throat dry. Someone's in the bathroom. He frowned, then turned to his screen, typing something. No, he said. That room's been vacant for 3 days. I just stared at him. What? He turned the screen toward me. The system showed my reservation. Room 724. But right under it. Guest checked out 3 days ago. The suitcase. The phone. The watch. None of it made sense. I called the police. They searched the room. Nothing. No suitcase. No phone. No watch. Just an empty room. I didn't stay the night. I drove 3 hours to another hotel. The next day, I checked the news for anything: missing person reports, police investigations. Nothing. But I know what I saw. I know someone was in that room. It was a regular Thursday night, maybe around 1 a.m. I just finished up with my last few fares, and I was on my way home. The streets were empty, and the city felt oddly quiet, like it had gone to sleep without me. I'd been driving for a couple of hours already and figured I could call it a night soon. Then, my phone pinged. A new ride request. I tapped to accept it, expecting a quick pickup, drop off, and then I could finally get some rest. The destination wasn't too far, just a few blocks away in a quieter part of town. When I pulled up to the address, I saw her standing by the curb, wrapped in a light jacket, shoulders hunched against the cold. I had to squint a little to make sure it was her. The woman was looking at her phone, so I waited for a second before flashing my headlights. She looked up, saw me, and started walking toward the car. She looked like she was in her late 20s, early 30s, nothing about her seemed out of the ordinary. I unlocked the doors, and she climbed in the back seat without saying a word. I greeted her, though. Hey, how's it going? She smiled, just a little, but didn't say much. Good, she replied. Her voice was soft, like she was still waking up or lost in thought. You? Good, I said, trying to make small talk. You heading home late? Yeah, just got off work, she replied, her tone still distant. Long shift. I'm just glad to be heading home. I nodded and glanced at the road. I wasn't expecting much conversation. Most people don't talk much late at night, especially after a long day. But she seemed polite enough, so I figured I'd ask her a few more questions just to keep the ride comfortable. I turned the volume on the radio down a little. So, what do you do for work? I asked, keeping my voice casual. She let out a small sigh, like she was trying to figure out how much she wanted to share. I'm a nurse. At the ER. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching her as she looked out the window, her face partially illuminated by the streetlights that passed. That must be tough, especially at night, I said, trying to empathize. I can imagine it's a lot of pressure, huh? She shrugged, though I could tell she was exhausted. It is, but it's what I signed up for. There was something almost robotic about how she said it. Like she'd said the same thing 1,000 times before. I could tell she didn't really want to talk, so I focused on the road, thinking about how much longer the ride would be. The car hummed along the streets, the only sound besides the soft clicking of the turn signal when I made a left. A few minutes passed in silence, and I noticed that we were getting close to the destination. It wasn't far from where I picked her up, but the area was a little quieter, with fewer streetlights. Almost no one was around at this hour. I slowed down as we reached the block she was going to. I could see the house on the corner, dark and quiet. When I stopped, I glanced in the rearview mirror, about to say something to her, maybe wish her a good night. But when I turned to look, the back seat was empty. I froze. The door wasn't open, and there wasn't any sign of her leaving. The seatbelt on the passenger side was still clipped in, but there was no sign of a woman. Just nothing. I turned around in my seat, looked around the back seat and the empty space around it. I had driven with her for a few minutes, and she had been sitting right there just a moment ago. I checked the rearview mirror again to make sure I hadn't just missed something. But there was no sign of her anywhere. Confused, I turned off the engine and grabbed my phone to check the ride details. But when I opened the app, there was nothing. No new ride request. No completed ride. Nothing. I checked the ride history, thinking maybe I'd missed something. But there was no sign of any ride with her, not even in the past half hour. I was starting to feel uneasy. I had no explanation for what had just happened. There was no way I could have imagined her. She had been in my back seat, sitting right there, her voice soft and tired. But there was no record of the ride. Not even a trace of her in the system. I sat there for a moment, trying to shake off the confusion. Maybe I had just been too tired to think straight. Maybe it was some glitch in the system. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I turned around again, hoping to see her maybe standing outside, walking toward the house, or that she had just gotten out in some weird way. But there was nothing. No one. The street was empty. The feeling of unease grew stronger. I started to drive away, but I couldn't help myself. I looked at the back seat one last time, just to be sure. It was empty. Still empty. I drove home that night, trying to shake off the feeling. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It was like she'd never been there, but I knew she had. The voice, the soft sighs, the quiet exhaustion. The feeling of someone sitting right behind me. I went home and checked the app again, but there was still no record of the ride. I even checked my payment history, thinking maybe it was a mistake or a glitch in the system. But no, nothing. I haven't driven for the rideshare service since. Every time I go to open the app, I think about that ride. I think about how real it felt, how she was there, and then just wasn't. I don't know what happened, but I know one thing. She was there. And somehow, she disappeared before I could even say goodbye. I moved into the apartment on a Sunday, a little over a month ago. It was small, but that was fine with me. I wasn't expecting anything fancy. The rent was cheap, which is why I had taken it in the first place. The place was old, a little run down, but still better than a dorm room. My parents had helped me move in, but they left after a couple of hours. They were in a hurry to get back home, and to be honest, I was happy to be alone. The first few days were normal. I unpacked, set up my things, and tried to settle in. The apartment was quiet, which I liked. I could focus on my studies, and I had enough space for everything I needed. But there was one thing that started to bother me. One closet in the hallway. It was small, tucked away in the corner, but it had this weird, heavy door that was locked. I tried to open it a few times, but the handle was jammed, so I just forgot about it for a while. At first, I thought it was just one of those things, you know, an old apartment where they lock certain spaces for no reason. Maybe it was for storage or something that wasn't meant to be accessed. But the longer I lived there, the more I thought about that closet. Something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the fact that it was locked. It was the way the door looked old and worn, with scuff marks along the bottom, like it had been moved around a lot. The hinges seemed new, though. They didn't match the rest of the apartment. I started thinking about it more often, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off about that closet. A week passed, and I found myself standing in front of the door again. This time, I felt an urge to open it. I don't know what it was, curiosity, maybe, but I couldn't stop thinking about what was inside. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to get in there. I grabbed a paperclip from my desk and tried to jimmy the lock. It didn't work. So, I grabbed a butter knife from the kitchen and tried to wedge it into the lock. That didn't work either. At that point, I wasn't sure if I was wasting my time or if there really was something in there I needed to see. But I wasn't going to give up. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought a small crowbar. When I came back, I got to work. I pried at the edges of the door, careful not to make too much noise. It felt like forever before I finally heard a satisfying click. The door popped open a little, just enough for me to slip inside. The moment I opened it, the air felt different. It was stale, musty, like it had been closed for years. The light from the hallway barely reached inside. I stepped in slowly, unsure of what I'd find. The closet was small, just enough room for a couple of shelves and some empty space. I thought it might be full of old boxes or something left behind by previous tenants, but that wasn't what I saw. There was a sleeping bag in the corner, folded up and tossed aside like someone had been using it. I didn't know what to think of it at first. Why would anyone leave a sleeping bag in there? But that wasn't all. There were empty food containers scattered around the floor, cans of soup, a few plastic forks and spoons, wrappers from granola bars. They looked recent, as though someone had eaten here just a few days ago. But what really made my stomach drop were the footprints. I don't know why I didn't notice them at first. I should have. But when I looked down at the dusty floor, I saw fresh footprints leading from the sleeping bag toward the back wall of the closet. The dust was disturbed, the prints clear and recent, like someone had been walking around in there just a day or two ago. My heart started racing. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, staring at the footprints, my mind trying to make sense of everything. Had someone been living in this closet? The thought made my skin crawl. The door had been locked, but there was no way it had stayed locked without someone knowing how to open it. My hands started shaking, and I felt the urge to leave. I stepped back, but as I did, I noticed something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. The back wall of the closet was different from the rest. There was a small crack in the wood, like something had been pressed against it from the other side. I took a step forward, reaching out to touch it, and when I did, I felt a cold draft from the crack. I pulled back quickly, feeling the panic rise in my chest. Someone had been inside my apartment, in my closet, hiding in there without me knowing. I didn't know what to think anymore. My mind raced with all the possibilities. Had someone been living here before me? Or was there someone still hiding in the apartment right now? I shut the door as quickly as I could and locked it again. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. The thought of someone being in the closet, watching me without me knowing, made my stomach turn. I grabbed my phone and called my roommate, who I hadn't heard from all day, and tried to explain what had happened. But she didn't answer. I sat down on the floor, my back against the door, and waited. I waited for her to come back, for the feeling to pass. But I knew something was wrong. I couldn't stay there another night. I couldn't sleep knowing that someone could have been in that closet, or worse, still be hiding in the apartment somewhere. When my roommate finally came home late that night, I explained everything to her. She was skeptical at first, but when we both went back into the closet, the food containers and the sleeping bag were still there. The footprints were still there. Everything was exactly the same. We called the landlord the next day. He had no idea about the closet. He said he would send someone over to take a look at it, but I knew something wasn't right. I moved out that week. I didn't care what the landlord said or whether they fixed the door or not. I wasn't staying there another night. To this day, I have no idea who was in that closet, but I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who lived in that apartment. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed it. I'd just woken up, the kind of waking where you're not really sure if you were ever asleep to begin with. The house was quiet, too quiet. My husband, Michael, was snoring softly beside me. I turned over to glance at the baby monitor on the nightstand. It was just a quick habit checking on our 6-month-old, Emily. She was a heavy sleeper, always had been, so I wasn't expecting to see anything strange. At first, the screen showed nothing but the dim glow of her nursery. The soft pastel colors of the room lit up by the monitor's low light. I don't know why, but I felt uneasy the moment I looked at it. My eyes drifted to the crib, and there she was, lying in her usual position, her little body curled up, her favorite blanket clutched in her hands. Nothing unusual at first. But then the image on the monitor shifted. It was subtle, just a small movement, the kind you might think was nothing if you weren't paying close attention. I squinted, trying to focus. Emily's blanket moved a little. I thought it was just her ticking in her sleep, so I dismissed it and settled back into the bed. But the movement didn't stop. I sat up, the unease creeping into my chest. I stared at the screen. Emily was no longer just lying there. She was shifting, slowly turning her head as if something had woken her up. The blanket twisted in odd ways that I didn't remember her ever doing before. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just half dreaming, but when I looked again, I realized something didn't feel right. At this point, I was wide awake, my heart starting to beat faster. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but a deep, instinctive sense of dread started building up. I glanced at Michael, still asleep beside me, oblivious. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 2:05 a.m. There was no way Emily was awake at this hour. She had been sleeping soundly since her bedtime at 8. I turned the volume on the monitor up, straining to hear. For a moment, there was only silence, then a small rustle, the sound of the blanket being moved again. I leaned forward. There was definitely something wrong. It felt like the air had thickened around me. I stood up slowly, trying not to wake Michael. The baby monitor's light illuminated my way as I walked toward the door. I tiptoed down the hallway, stopping at the doorway to Emily's nursery. I didn't want to make a sound, but I had to see what was going on. The baby monitor was still showing movement, the screen flickering as the blanket shifted. I hesitated, then pushed the door open just a crack. The nursery was quiet. Too quiet. The soft glow of the nightlight gave everything a ghostly tint, and the room looked normal at first glance. Emily was still in her crib, the blanket wrapped tightly around her, just as I had seen on the monitor. But something felt off. My breath caught in my throat. I was about to turn around and go back to bed when I noticed it, a reflection. It was in the mirror across the room, just behind the crib. For a split second, I thought I might have imagined it, but then the reflection moved. A man, standing right behind Emily. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure was tall, thin, and his face was distorted, a blur in the mirror. I couldn't make out any clear details, but I could tell he was wearing a dark jacket, and he was standing so still. His back was to me, but I could feel his presence. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I felt paralyzed. I held my breath, praying that I was imagining it. But as I stared at the reflection, I could see the man's hands move. He reached down toward Emily. My heart pounded in my chest. Every part of me wanted to scream, to rush into the room, but I couldn't make myself move. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the man was gone. The reflection disappeared, and I couldn't see him in the mirror anymore. Emily was still there in her crib, her tiny body barely moving, her face relaxed in sleep. I didn't know what to do. I had to get in there, but I was terrified. I didn't know who this man was or what he wanted. Every instinct in my body screamed to protect my daughter. I pushed the door open wider, my hands shaking. I took one step into the room, then another. My feet felt like they were moving through thick mud. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror, the place where I had seen him just moments before. I reached the crib. Emily was still asleep, just like she had been when I first checked the monitor. I touched her gently, her warm skin sending a wave of relief through me. She was okay, but the fear that had gripped me didn't let go. I turned slowly, scanning the room. Everything seemed fine now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced at the window. It was locked. The door was still closed. There was no sign of anyone else being in the room. I backed away from the crib, still watching the mirror, waiting for something, anything, that would tell me where that man had gone. Nothing. It was just my reflection, just the dim light and the quiet nursery. I ran back to the bedroom, my heart still hammering in my chest. Michael was still asleep, oblivious to everything that had happened. I collapsed into bed, trying to steady my breath. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, unable to close my eyes. I kept thinking about the man in the mirror. Why hadn't I heard him? Why had I only seen him in the reflection? Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked every lock, every window, and I even went outside to make sure everything was secure. There were no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints, no disturbances. The weirdest part was that when I looked at the baby monitor again, I couldn't see anything strange. Emily was peacefully asleep, just like always. I checked the nursery several times throughout the day. It was just a normal room. But I couldn't forget the reflection. I don't know if it was a dream or if I imagined it, but I know what I saw. And after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. It was a long time before I could walk past that mirror without shuddering. I still don't know who the man was or what he wanted, but I'm sure I wasn't imagining it. I was wide awake and I saw him, clear as day, standing right behind my daughter. I had just finished dinner, around 8:30 on a Tuesday night. It was a quiet evening, the kind you don't think much about, but something happened that night, something that made me question everything. I live in a small suburban neighborhood, pretty quiet, mostly families, a few retirees, and not much ever happens here. I was sitting on my couch, watching TV, when I heard a knock at the door. It was one of those knocks where you're not sure if you really heard it or not, like a light tap that almost feels like it's your mind playing tricks on you. I ignored it at first, thinking it might be a neighbor or someone dropping off a package. But then, it came again. A little more insistent this time. I looked at the clock. 8:40, Too late for anyone to be coming around. The only people who usually knock on my door are the occasional delivery guy or my neighbor, Mr. Bennett, when he needs something. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I felt a little uneasy as I walked over to the door. I peeked through the peephole. There was a man standing there in a standard blue work uniform. He had a badge on, but it was too small to read through the peephole. He looked normal enough, though something about his presence made my skin crawl. He wasn't standing like someone who had just dropped by for a friendly chat. He was standing a little too still, like he was waiting for me to open the door. I didn't open it. Instead, I opened the small window next to the door. I'm not sure why I did that, but I needed to hear what he had to say before I let him in. "Good evening, ma'am," the man said, his voice polite but a little too calm. "I'm from the power company. I need to check your meter inside." I wasn't sure what to make of it. I've lived here for years, and I've never once had anyone from the power company come to my house unannounced. They always send a letter, or at least call ahead, before showing up at someone's door. I couldn't remember ever getting a notification or anything about maintenance, but I tried not to jump to conclusions. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't recall getting any notice about this. Can I see some identification?" The man seemed unfazed. "Of course," he said, reaching for his pocket and pulling out a card. He held it up to the window. It looked official, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The card was blurry, like it had been printed on a low-quality printer. And the company name was a little too generic. "I'm afraid I'll need to come inside to do the check," he added, his voice still too calm. "It'll only take a minute." I felt my chest tighten. There was no way in hell I was letting a stranger into my house, especially not at this hour. I wasn't going to be rude, but I wasn't going to let him in either. "I'm sorry, but I'm not comfortable with that," I told him. "I'm going to call the power company just to confirm." The man didn't seem bothered. He just nodded politely and stepped back a little, as though he was giving me space to make the call. I quickly closed the window and stepped away from the door, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for the power company. They were open 24 hours, so I was hoping they'd answer. A few rings and then a calm, automated voice picked up. "Thank you for calling, power company. How can I assist you today?" I pressed a few buttons to get to the right department, then waited. After what felt like forever, I finally spoke with a customer service agent. I gave her my address and asked if they had scheduled any technicians to come by. "No, ma'am," she said after a brief pause. "We have no record of any technicians being sent to your location. Is everything okay?" I felt a cold shiver run through me. I told her about the man outside, and she seemed as confused as I was. "I would suggest you don't open the door, and if you feel uncomfortable, please contact the police immediately," she said in a serious tone. I hung up, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to do next. I wasn't sure if the man was dangerous, but everything about him felt off. I needed to make sure I wasn't just overreacting. I glanced back out the peephole. He was still there, standing perfectly still, as though he was waiting for me to come to some sort of decision. I backed away from the door and looked around my living room. There were no weapons in sight, but I had a kitchen knife in the drawer. I grabbed it, just in case. The minutes dragged on. I debated whether I should call the police. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, if maybe he was just some kind of misunderstanding, but the way he stood there waiting was unnerving. I checked the peephole again. This time, he wasn't standing still. He had turned his head slightly, as though he was trying to see through the peephole to get a better look at me. I quickly pulled away, my breath coming fast. I couldn't explain it, but something about his expression felt almost predatory. A few more minutes went by. Then, he knocked again. Not the polite knock from before, but this time it was more insistent, louder, harder. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring this. I had to do something. I called the police. They arrived about 20 minutes later. By that time, the man was gone. They looked around the yard and talked to me briefly, but he had left without a trace. No car, no sign of anyone having been there for a while. The officers took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. It didn't seem like a crime had actually been committed, and the power company confirmed there was no scheduled technician for the area. Still, they advised me to stay cautious and recommended I keep the doors locked. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing noises outside, even though I knew there was nothing out there. My mind kept replaying the moment when the man looked through the peephole, when I saw his face so close, and the way he didn't react when I refused to let him in. I still don't know who he was, or what he wanted. It's been weeks now, and nothing has happened since. But I've never felt the same walking around my house. I'm always double-checking the locks now, looking out the windows. I never let anyone in without confirming who they are, and I'll never forget that gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had just finished a long day at work and was ready to head home. It was around midnight when I got to the subway station. The train was almost empty, with just a few passengers scattered across the cars. I wasn't bothered by it. Late-night trains are usually pretty quiet, and I preferred the solitude. The city was loud enough during the day, and I liked the calm that came with being one of the last people on the train. I remember feeling a little tired, the kind of exhaustion that makes your eyelids heavy. The ride was smooth, and I tried to keep myself awake, but my eyes kept fluttering shut for a second here and there. It wasn't a long ride, just a few stops before I would get off, but it felt like time was dragging. I stared out the window, watching the dark tunnels pass by, the flickering lights overhead casting brief shadows on the walls. When the train passed a few more stops, the car started to empty. One by one, passengers got off at their destinations. I didn't pay much attention to it, though. I had my earbuds in, listening to some music to help distract me from how tired I felt. At some point, I noticed that the train car was nearly empty, with just me and one other man still sitting across from each other. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a long coat and dark pants. He didn't stand out in any way, and I thought nothing of him at first. People doze off or bury their faces in their phones, especially late at night. I was starting to drift off when I felt something that made me look up. It wasn't a sound, not a movement, but more of an odd, heavy feeling. The man across from me was staring directly at me. His eyes were wide open, his gaze locked onto mine. He wasn't blinking. Not even once. I tried to ignore it, figuring he was just zoning out, but it was hard to shake the unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't normal. I've ridden the subway enough times to know that people don't just stare like that. Most of the time, people mind their business and look out the windows or check their phones. Maybe they glance at each other, but this guy wasn't doing any of that. He was staring directly at me, and he hadn't blinked once since I noticed him. I shifted in my seat, trying to make myself as small as possible, hoping maybe he'd stop staring if I didn't engage with him. But it didn't work. His eyes didn't leave me. I started to feel uncomfortable, like my skin was crawling. The car was so quiet that the sound of the train's wheels on the tracks seemed louder, the rhythmic clanking almost deafening compared to the silence between us. I glanced around the car, hoping someone else might be nearby to distract him, but it was just the two of us. The train was moving slower now, nearing my stop, but I had the sinking feeling that something was wrong. He didn't blink. He just kept staring. I didn't want to look at him anymore, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It felt like my brain was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen. Every time I shifted my gaze, I'd feel the weight of his eyes boring into me, like his stare was anchored in my soul. I don't know how long it went on, but it felt like an eternity. I kept thinking that maybe he'd look away soon. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe he was lost in thought. But he didn't break his gaze. Not once. I tried to tell myself to stay calm. It's just a guy. Maybe he's a little weird, but no one would do anything, right? Not in a public place like this, not when it was nearly empty. Still, there was something off about it. Something unnatural. I kept thinking, maybe he's just trying to figure me out, like he knows something about me. My mind raced through all these scenarios. I was overthinking, I knew that, but my body wouldn't relax. The train slowed even more as it approached the next station. I tried to calm my breathing, hoping my stop would be soon. But it wasn't. The train didn't stop, it just kept going. It was strange. My stop was supposed to be the next one, but the train kept moving, and it didn't slow down at all. I checked the map above the door, my heart racing now, and saw that we were passing stations that should have been ahead of mine. I started to feel the panic rising in my chest. I looked up again, and the man's eyes were still locked on me. I had to get off the train. Now! I stood up quickly, my hands shaking. I had no idea what was happening, but my body was telling me to leave. I grabbed a metal pole for support, but when I looked around, I realized something else. The doors weren't opening. I tried to press the button, but it didn't work. I pushed it again, harder this time, but the doors wouldn't budge. My stomach turned, and for the first time, I truly felt afraid. This wasn't normal. I could hear my own heartbeat now, louder than the sound of the train. I turned back to the man, desperate for a hint, for something. But his face remained expressionless, his eyes wide open, staring. He hadn't moved a muscle. I didn't know what he was waiting for. Then, the train came to a stop. It wasn't at a station. It was just stopped. The lights flickered once, then dimmed. The man still hadn't blinked, and I felt my legs turn to jelly. My mind was racing, trying to think, trying to come up with a plan, but nothing made sense. I had no choice. I had to try the door again. I ran over to it and slammed my hand against the button. This time, the door opened. I didn't wait for it to fully open. I just jumped out onto the platform, not even looking back. The moment I stepped off the train, the doors slammed shut behind me, and I heard the train pull away. I don't remember walking back to the entrance of the station. I just remember feeling that icy sense of relief when I stepped outside. I didn't look back, didn't even check to see if the man was still on the train. I just walked. I didn't run, but I didn't stop either. I don't know what that man wanted. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe he was just a tired commuter or someone who didn't know what personal space was. But I'll never forget that feeling of being trapped, of his unblinking stare following me all the way until I couldn't take it anymore. I haven't ridden the last train home since that night. And every time I close my eyes, I can still feel those eyes on me. I'm not one to throw parties often, but I had some friends visiting and thought it would be nice to host a small get-together at my apartment. Nothing crazy, just a few people, some drinks, and good conversation. It was supposed to be a relaxing evening. I didn't expect anything strange to happen, but looking back, I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong from the start. It was a Saturday, and by the time people started trickling in, the apartment felt full of laughter and music. There were maybe 8 of us in total, all close friends. We mingled in the living room, and I remember feeling a bit more anxious than usual. I tend to get nervous hosting, but I didn't think much of it. I was too busy keeping the drinks flowing and making sure everyone was comfortable. The evening went on without issue. We had fun. People laughed, joked, and a few stayed later than the others. By the time everyone left, it was well past midnight. I cleaned up a little but wasn't too concerned about it, thinking I'd finish in the morning. Everyone had a good time, and I was just glad it was all over. The next morning, I woke up to an empty apartment and the usual post-party mess. Empty bottles, half-eaten snacks, some spilled drinks on the floor. I started picking up, throwing away bottles, and wiping down surfaces. It was all the usual aftermath of hosting. But then, as I was picking up the jackets and bags people had left behind, I noticed something odd. There was a jacket I didn't recognize. It wasn't one of mine, and it wasn't any of my friends either. It was a dark green, slightly worn, with a couple of buttons missing. I didn't know who it belonged to, but I figured maybe someone had just left it behind without thinking much of it. I picked it up and scanned the room, thinking maybe someone had left it hanging around when they got up to leave, but I didn't see anyone else's stuff lying around. I didn't really think much of it at first, but then I started to wonder who it belonged to. No one mentioned anything about a jacket when they were leaving, and no one seemed to have noticed it. Maybe someone had brought a plus one I didn't know about, but I would have remembered if someone had come with a guest. Everyone I invited was accounted for. I sent a quick message to the group chat asking if anyone had left their jacket behind. At first, everyone responded with confusion. They all asked, "What jacket?" or "I didn't bring one." I figured maybe I had just missed it somehow, or someone had grabbed it by accident. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized no one had mentioned anything about bringing someone else. I didn't even remember anyone walking in with a jacket like that. As I waited for responses, I couldn't help but feel a growing unease. I went through the events of the night in my head, trying to recall anything strange. There was a man I didn't recognize standing in the kitchen for a while. I hadn't paid much attention to him at the time. I thought he was one of my friend's boyfriends or maybe a friend of a friend. But he hadn't talked to me much. He mostly stood in the corner, drinking quietly and just observing. I didn't think anything of it because I wasn't really paying attention to every single person at the party. But now, with the jacket in my hands, I wondered if he was the one who had brought it. I didn't remember seeing him leave. My friends would have noticed him, right? They would have mentioned him, wouldn't they? I asked again in the group chat, "Hey, does anyone remember a guy being at the party last night?" The responses came slowly, and most were just confused. A few said they didn't remember anyone who wasn't a regular part of our group. But one of my friends said something that caught me off guard. "Wait, who was that guy standing by the kitchen? Wasn't he with you?" I couldn't answer her. I had no idea who she was talking about. I wasn't the only one who had noticed him, but it seemed like no one else had really talked to him either. The more I thought about it, the more I realized he had just been there. No one knew who he was, and no one remembered inviting him. I didn't want to panic, but I started to feel really uncomfortable. I took the jacket and went back to the spot by the door, where I thought I'd seen him earlier. The coat was still there, untouched. I had been too busy with the party to pay attention to everyone's comings and goings, but I knew it hadn't been there before. I thought back to the end of the night, when everyone was leaving. No one had mentioned this man at all. I tried to call the friend who had stayed the latest to ask her if she'd seen anyone unfamiliar, but she didn't pick up. I called a few more people, but no one could remember anything about this man. It was like he didn't exist. They all agreed, though, that they'd never seen him before. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The jacket felt heavy in my hands, like it had some kind of weight to it that I couldn't explain. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen this man leave, and now I was holding his jacket in my hands. I felt like I was missing something crucial. By the afternoon, I was too unsettled to stay in the apartment alone. I went to my neighbor's place for a while, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But I kept thinking about the jacket. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. It wasn't one of my friends, and it wasn't mine. Who had brought it? Who had left it behind? The worst part was that no one seemed to remember this man, not a single person, and that left me feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. He had been there, hadn't he? I wasn't imagining it, was I? I went back to the apartment later that evening to check if the jacket was still there. It was. But something else had changed, something I didn't notice earlier. The floor, where the man had been standing, looked slightly disturbed. It wasn't a huge difference, but there were a few marks on the carpet, as if someone had been pacing in that spot for a while. I didn't know what to do with the jacket, so I put it in a plastic bag and tossed it in the back of my closet. I haven't thought about it much since then, but every time I look at the coat now, I can't help but feel a chill. Something about that night still doesn't sit right with me. The more I try to push it out of my head, the more I wonder, who was that man, and why does no one else remember him? When I first bought the house, it felt like a steal. The place was old, sure, but I liked that. I'd always wanted a project to sink my teeth into, and this house had a lot of character. It had been sitting vacant for years, and the previous owners didn't exactly take care of it. So, when I moved in, I knew I'd have my work cut out for me. There was always something to fix: leaky pipes, peeling wallpaper, squeaky floors. But I was okay with that. It kept me busy, and I didn't mind spending my evenings hammering, painting, and fixing what I could. I spent the first few days getting familiar with the house. It was a typical two-story, with a decent yard, a big kitchen, and a basement I was planning to turn into a small office space. The attic, though, it was always something I'd put off. The door was at the end of a long hallway, up on the second floor, behind an old, creaky wooden door. I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just full of dust, maybe some old boxes or forgotten furniture. It wasn't until about 2 weeks after moving in that I finally decided to look up there. I had already made progress in the other rooms and figured it'd be good to clear out the attic next. So, one afternoon, I grabbed a ladder from the garage and set it up under the door. The first thing that struck me was how strange the door felt. I'd passed by it dozens of times, but that day, I swore something was off about it. The door itself was old, like everything else in the house, but it didn't look like it was used often. There was dust around the edges, and the paint was chipped in some spots, but the hinges seemed well-oiled, like someone had opened it recently. I had to put a little muscle into it, but the door creaked open. The smell hit me first. It was musty, like old paper and mold, but there was something else underneath, something a little fresher. I'd expected it to smell worse, honestly. The whole house had a sort of dampness to it, but the attic smelled different. Less like abandonment, more like someone had been there recently. I pulled the ladder up and climbed into the attic, flashlight in hand. The room was small, with low ceilings, and it had a few small windows that were mostly blocked by boxes and what looked like old furniture draped in dusty sheets. But as I moved further into the room, my foot hit something soft. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a pile of old blankets or clothes, but when I shined my light on it, I saw what it really was. A mattress. It was placed right in the center of the room, tucked away behind a pile of old furniture. It was an old, worn mattress, covered in a faded sheet that had yellowed over time. And next to it, a small, wooden table with a half-eaten sandwich on a plate. The bread was soggy, and I could see a few flies hovering over it. But that wasn't the worst part. Beside the plate, there was a journal. It was simple, with a brown leather cover, and it looked like it had been used a lot. The edges of the pages were worn, and the ink on the cover was smudged, like it had been handled 1,000 times. I picked it up, my hands trembling. I didn't know why I was scared, but something in my gut told me I shouldn't be touching it. I opened the journal, and the first thing that caught my eye was the date. It was written in a neat hand, the ink fresh but faded in places, like it had been written some time ago. October 12th, 2020. I looked back at the date again, confused. This wasn't just some random, forgotten object. The journal described my day. It started with the routine I followed since moving in. The entry talked about the sounds I made while walking around the house, the creaking of the floors, the exact time I'd started eating dinner on that evening. It was as though the writer was following me. Not just that day, but for days before, too. The entries mentioned things I hadn't even noticed, like how I always used a specific cup for coffee, how I checked the pipes in the kitchen, even what I'd worn while working on the house. The deeper I went into the journal, the more unnerving it became. The handwriting was consistent, but as the pages went on, I could feel a sense of unease building in the words. The entries grew more detailed, describing moments in my life with disturbing accuracy. It was like this person had been watching me, no, living in my house. They knew my schedule better than I did. I couldn't stop reading. I turned to a page that was marked with a folded piece of paper. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it, and my throat went dry. The note inside was short, but it made my stomach drop. Don't leave the house. They'll come for you if you do. They're watching. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know who had left this, or why they had left these entries, but it felt like the entire house had shifted in that moment. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt dizzy, like the walls were closing in. I shoved the journal into my bag and quickly descended from the attic. My feet felt unsteady, like I wasn't even walking on solid ground anymore. The entire house seemed to change in an instant. I went back downstairs and locked the front door, then bolted the windows. I knew I was overreacting, that I had to calm down, but the fear kept eating at me. I'd never felt like this before. Like something was off in my own home. The worst part? It wasn't until the next day that I noticed it. The mattress. The one in the attic, the one I thought was so out of place. It wasn't there anymore. I went back up into the attic to check, and it was gone. Like it had never been there. I've been living in this house for months now, and I haven't gone back up to the attic. Every time I go into the room, the air feels heavier. Like someone's still there. I hear sounds I can't explain, footsteps, things shifting, but when I look around, there's nothing. And the journal? I buried it in the yard, but it feels like it's still watching me. Whoever that person was, whoever had been in my house before me, I can't shake the feeling that they're still here. Watching. Waiting. I don't know what to do with the house now. It's not the same anymore. I can't help but wonder if I've made a terrible mistake. I don't know who wrote that journal, or how they knew my every move, but I do know one thing. I'm not safe here. It happened last Thursday. I won't forget that day anytime soon. I was at the grocery store, just like I always am on Thursday afternoons. I had my list in hand, and I was doing the usual, grabbing fruit, vegetables, the random things I always forget, like eggs and milk. It was a typical shopping trip, nothing unusual at all. But then, he approached me. I was in the aisle with canned goods, trying to decide between two brands of tomato sauce when I heard someone say, "Hey, Sarah." It wasn't my name in a casual, "Hey, how's it going?" kind of way. It was my name, said in the way someone says it when they already know you, like they've been waiting for you to turn around and acknowledge them. I looked up, a little startled, and saw a man standing about 10 feet away. He was smiling at me. He looked ordinary enough, mid-40s, average build, a bit of stubble on his chin, casual clothes. But something about him made me uneasy right away. "Do I know you?" I asked. It wasn't a rude question, more out of confusion. I racked my brain, trying to figure out where I might have seen him before, but nothing came to mind. He smiled wider, like he was enjoying this. "We haven't met formally, but I've been watching you for a while." The smile didn't reach his eyes, and those words hit me like a slap to the face. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a sudden chill running down my spine. He took a small step closer, but not enough to make me feel cornered. Just enough that I could feel his presence more clearly. I stepped back a little, trying to maintain my distance. "I've been watching you," he repeated, his voice softer this time, like he was trying to be reassuring, even though it had the opposite effect. "You're always here, every Thursday. Same time." My heart started to beat a little faster. I tried to keep calm, but the sinking feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. I didn't recognize him. I hadn't seen him before. The idea that someone would be paying that much attention to my routine unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. "Look," I said, forcing myself to stay composed, "I think you're confusing me with someone else." I turned back toward the shelves, hoping the conversation would just end, but I could still feel his eyes on me. "No, I don't think I am." He sounded almost friendly, but it wasn't the kind of friendly that made me feel safe. "You're Sarah, right? From the yoga class on Mondays? You always sit by the window." My throat went dry. I had taken yoga classes for months, but I'd never talked to him. I didn't know anyone there by that name. The worst part was that the more he said, the more familiar his description of me was. The details he'd mentioned were accurate. I did sit by the window every Monday, but I hadn't told anyone that. How could he know that? "Okay, you're really scaring me," I said, backing up another step. I couldn't tell if he was just some harmless weirdo who didn't know how to take a hint or if something was off. Either way, I needed to get out of this situation. He finally looked at me like he understood my discomfort. "Sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his tone light, as if we were still having a casual conversation. "I just thought we could talk. It's funny, really. I've seen you so many times. I feel like I know you." I shook my head, trying to keep calm, but my hands were shaking. "No, we don't know each other. And I don't want to talk to you." He just stood there for a moment, still smiling, his gaze locked on mine. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to leave, that he was going to try to push further. But then, to my surprise, he nodded, as though he understood and decided to respect my boundaries. "All right, "I'll go," he said, still with that smile. "But you're always here. Always. Just so you know." I nodded quickly, trying to look uninterested, and made a beeline for the nearest checkout. The whole time, I could feel his eyes on me, even as I walked away. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just some guy who had happened to notice me a few times. No, this felt different. He knew too much. He knew details that no stranger should know. The rest of the time in the store was a blur. I paid for my groceries in a daze, my mind racing, and when I got into my car, I locked the doors before I even started the engine. I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at the back of my mind. When I got home, I did what I always do. I locked all the doors, checked the windows, and turned on the lights. But there was still this nagging feeling that I wasn't safe. I tried to go about my evening, but it was impossible to shake the sense that I was being watched. I haven't seen him since, but I've been back to the store twice since that day, and I always make sure I check the aisles before I turn a corner. I've been looking over my shoulder more than usual, especially at the yoga class on Mondays. I'm not paranoid, but I can't help but feel that I'm being followed. I don't know what his intentions were, or why he approached me in that way, but I'm starting to think he wasn't just some random person who noticed me. I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending everything's fine. Something tells me that I haven't seen the last of him. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but I need to get it out. I've been holding it in for a while, and the longer I keep it to myself, the more I can't stop thinking about it. Maybe writing it down will make it feel real, or maybe just make it go away. I don't know. But here it is. It happened a few weeks ago, one of those nights where everything feels a little off. I was on the road, driving from one town to another, a trip that I had done hundreds of times before. It wasn't an especially long drive, but I had left later than planned and was pushing through the night to get to my destination. It was about 2 a.m. when I decided I needed to stop. I'd been driving for hours and I was starting to feel that weariness creeping in. The kind of tired that makes your eyes heavy and your mind fuzzy. I knew there was a gas station not far off the highway, one of those 24-hour places with the bright lights and the convenience store that never closes. I didn't expect much, just a quick stop to refuel and maybe grab a coffee to stay awake. When I saw the sign, I thought nothing of it. The lights were on, and I was relieved to finally get some rest, even if only for a few minutes. As I pulled into the parking lot, something felt strange. There was no other car in sight. The lot was empty. No other vehicles, no other people. It was just me and the bright, almost blinding lights of the gas station. I parked my car and got out, immediately noticing how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears, like the whole world is holding its breath. I thought it was odd, but didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the time of night, I reasoned. I walked toward the pumps, but that's when I noticed it. The door to the convenience store was wide open. I could see the fluorescent lights flickering inside, casting that sickly yellow glow across the dusty floor. The air was still, no hum of a machine, no sound of the pump kicking on. Just the eerie quiet. I looked around again. Still no cars. No customers. Nothing. I was starting to get that sinking feeling in my stomach. The kind of feeling you get when something isn't right, but you can't put your finger on it. I walked up to the door, peeking inside, but all I could see was empty aisles and a few signs hanging loosely, swaying in the faint breeze coming from the open door. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should just leave. But then I thought, what the hell? It was the only place around for miles, and I was running low on gas. I figured I could just fuel up and get going. The door was still open, and I could see the counter beyond, but there was no one standing behind it. No attendant, no cashier. It wasn't like a self-checkout kind of place either. I had been there before, so I knew that it wasn't a 24-hour automated station. There should have been someone inside. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No response. I walked further in, feeling a bit like an intruder. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights above me made it feel even more unsettling. I didn't hear the sound of the pumps either, not the usual clinking of gas filling up, the swish of the nozzle. It was dead quiet. My footsteps echoed across the concrete floor. I thought about going up to the counter to check, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt this uneasy sense of being watched. It wasn't a paranoia thing. I could swear I felt eyes on me, but when I looked around, the place was still empty. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It was almost 2:30 a.m. I was getting more and more uncomfortable by the second. But I couldn't just leave. I needed gas. I needed something to wake me up for the rest of the drive. And the place wasn't that bad, right? I mean, it was just an empty gas station. But the lack of any other cars, any sign of life, was making my skin crawl. I walked over to the nearest pump and tried to start it up. I wasn't sure how I expected to pay without anyone around, but maybe I could leave money on the counter or something. I felt foolish for not just getting back in my car and driving away, but I was already committed. I needed to get on the road. As I stood there pumping the gas, I noticed something else. Every car in the lot was abandoned. It wasn't just that no one was here now. It was that none of the cars looked like they had been recently parked. They were old, dirty, and covered in a layer of dust. Some of them had flat tires, others were missing parts like the side mirrors or the rear bumpers. None of them were in a condition to be driven. It was like they'd been left there for weeks, maybe longer. A chill ran down my spine. I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. It wasn't the usual feeling of being watched, but something else, something deeper. Something wrong. I finished fueling my car quickly, and I was about to leave when I heard a noise from inside the store. A small sound, like a rustle or a shuffle. I froze, listening. It came again, closer this time. My heartbeat quickened. I glanced toward the door, but the shadows inside were thick. I couldn't see past the racks. I didn't know if someone had come in or if it was just the building settling, but it sounded like something or someone was moving inside. Without thinking, I made a beeline for my car. I threw open the door, slammed it shut, and started the engine without a second thought. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The gas station was still there, quiet, empty. But in that moment, I knew something was wrong with it. I could feel it in my bones. I had no idea what it was, no idea why no one was there, why the cars were all abandoned, or why the store felt so wrong. But I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. I kept driving until I found another station down the road. That one was normal, attendant behind the counter, cars filling up, people walking around. I didn't even stop to get out. I just filled up and left as fast as I could. I've been home for a while now, and every time I think back to that night, I get the same sick feeling in my stomach. It wasn't just a weird gas station. It was something else. And I'm not sure what it was, but I'm not going back there. Ever. I've been sitting on this story for weeks now. I don't know why I'm even telling it. Maybe I need to get it off my chest. Or maybe I'm just hoping that someone will tell me I'm not losing my mind. Either way, it's been eating at me, and I need to talk about it. My boyfriend, Matt, and I had just moved into a new apartment. It was one of those old buildings with charm, but the kind of charm that means there's always something a little off. I don't know how else to explain it. The walls were thin, the floors creaked in strange places, and the lighting always seemed a bit dim, even in the middle of the day. Still, it was a good deal for the price, so we didn't think much of it. Our neighbor was a man in his late 40s, I guess. He was quiet, kept to himself, but friendly when we saw him. His name was Ron, and he lived in the unit next to ours. He wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to be in a place like that, quiet, a little weathered, but always with a smile and a nod when we passed each other in the hallway. He was one of those people who seemed perfectly normal on the surface, but after a while, there was something about him that didn't sit right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there. The first few days in the apartment were fine. We got our stuff settled, unpacked, and started to get used to the neighborhood. It wasn't bad at all. One night, after a long day of work and errands, Matt and I were laying in bed, watching TV. It was around 10:30, I think. I remember the time because I had just started feeling the exhaustion of the day settle in, and I was ready to drift off to sleep. That's when we heard it. At first, it was just shouting. Loud, angry shouting. We both sat up immediately. I didn't recognize the voices at first, but it didn't take long to figure out it was coming from Ron's apartment next door. It wasn't a normal argument either. It wasn't the kind of shouting you hear when people are just upset. It was aggressive. The kind of shouting that feels dangerous. Matt looked over at me, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. We didn't know Ron very well, but we talked to him enough to know he didn't seem like the kind of person to raise his voice like that. The shouting went on for a while. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just some argument or misunderstanding. But then, it got worse. There was a loud bang, a heavy thud that rattled the walls of our apartment. It was so loud that I could feel it in my chest. I jumped at the sound. Do you think we should check on him? I asked Matt, but I was already hesitating. What could we do? It was none of our business, right? But the bang had sounded so violent. I felt a cold pit in my stomach. Matt, looking uneasy, nodded. Maybe we should just make sure everything's okay. He got out of bed and walked to the door, pausing for a second before he turned the handle. I could see the apprehension on his face, but he opened the door anyway and stepped out into the hallway. I followed, my heart pounding. He knocked on Ron's door. There was no response. He knocked again, harder this time. Ron? Matt called out. No answer. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do. I could hear the shouting from inside, though it had quieted down a bit. It almost sounded like someone was crying, but it was hard to tell. We need to call the police, I said, my voice shaking a little. Matt agreed, and we both stepped back into our apartment. I don't know why we didn't just go ahead and do it immediately, but we didn't. Instead, we stood there for a minute, listening. The sounds from Ron's apartment were muffled now, almost as if they were moving away from the door. It wasn't like it had stopped, more like it had moved to the other side of the room. We waited a few more minutes. Then, just like that, everything fell silent. The silence felt so unnatural. It was deafening. Matt finally picked up his phone and dialed the police. I could hear him talking to them, explaining the situation, telling them about the shouting, the bang, everything. I don't remember exactly what they said on the other end, but they promised someone would be there soon, I felt a little bit of relief, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my stomach. It wasn't long before we heard the sirens. The flashing lights reflected through the window, making everything look more surreal. We watched from our apartment as two police cars parked outside the building, their lights cutting through the dark. They came up to our door, knocked, and asked us about what had happened. We explained what we had heard, and they took notes. They seemed just as concerned as we were. I remember one of the officers saying he would knock on Ron's door and make sure everything was okay. The police knocked for a while, but no one answered. Eventually, they used a key to unlock the door. When they went inside, they called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence. We stood there, unsure of what to do. Then, one of the officers came back out. His face was hard to read. "We need you to stay inside for a minute," he said to us. "We're going to check things out." "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice quiet. The officer didn't answer. He just turned and went back into the apartment, closing the door behind him. We waited, and I could feel the tension in the air. After what felt like hours, they finally came back out. They didn't say anything at first, just looked at each other. I could see their faces now. They were confused. "We've looked through the entire place," the officer said. "There's no sign of any disturbance. The apartment's empty." "Empty?" Matt asked, his voice rising. "What do you mean?" "We mean that no one's living there," the officer replied. "There's no sign anyone's lived there for months. The furniture's gone. The refrigerator's been cleaned out. There's nothing but dust and old newspapers." Matt and I exchanged a look. I couldn't make sense of it. But we heard the shouting. "The bang," I said. "We heard it. It was real." The officer nodded slowly, but his expression was still unreadable. "I don't know what to tell you. There's no one in that apartment now. There's no sign of anyone having been there for a long time." We both stood there, dumbfounded. I felt like I was dreaming. I didn't know how it was possible. It didn't make sense. Later that morning, the landlord came by to check on things. He said Ron had been living there for years. But when they went into Ron's apartment to see for themselves, it was completely empty. As though no one had ever lived there. I still don't understand what happened that night. But I haven't seen Ron since. No one has. The door to his apartment is still locked, and every time I pass it in the hallway, it feels like I'm walking past a door that's hiding something I'll never understand. Matt and I moved out of that building soon after. We never spoke to the police about it again. There's a part of me that wonders if we imagined it all, but there's another part of me that knows what we heard. And that part of me is terrified. It was around 10:30 at night when I decided to call an Uber. I had been at my friend's birthday party, and after a couple of hours, I was ready to head home. The night was cool, and I was standing on the sidewalk, waiting for the car to pull up. I usually don't mind waiting for a few minutes, but that night I was tired and just wanted to get home. When the app notified me that my ride was nearby, I pulled my coat tighter around me and looked down the street. A car appeared, slowing down as it neared me. I didn't think much of it at first. It was an older sedan, dark-colored, with the Uber logo on the side. I didn't even look at the driver's face when I got in. I was just too tired and wasn't in the mood for conversation. I opened the back door and slid in, giving a quick hello as I buckled my seatbelt. There was no response from the driver, but I didn't think anything of it. Some drivers are quieter than others. I pulled up my phone and opened up social media to pass the time, but I kept my eyes on the road through the rearview mirror. The driver seemed focused on the road, so I didn't expect him to talk much anyway. The car was quiet. Too quiet. After a minute or two, I glanced in the mirror. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I noticed something strange. His head was tilted slightly forward, and he hadn't moved. His hands were still on the wheel, but it didn't look like he was actively driving. The car was gliding along at a slow pace. It didn't feel right, but I thought maybe it was just me being paranoid. It wasn't until we had been driving for a few more minutes that I started to feel uncomfortable. The way he wasn't talking, the way he wasn't reacting to anything, it was all off. I glanced down at my phone to check the ride details. The little map on the app showed that we had driven about 2 miles already, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I could hear the faint hum of the engine, the road under the tires, but nothing else. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. It was just late, and maybe I was overthinking it. I pulled my phone back out, about to send a message to my friend when the notification came through. "Your Uber is arriving. Your ride will be there in 2 minutes." I stared at the screen. For a moment, I thought I had misread it. But the more I looked at it, the more it made sense. The map showed that my real Uber was just down the street. I could see it clearly. The car was a few blocks away, and it was almost here. But that couldn't be right. I was already in a car. Wasn't this my ride? I looked back at the driver. His face was still hidden in the shadows, but now I was sure he was staring straight ahead, not even blinking. I started to feel my heart pick up speed, the weight in my chest growing heavier. It was so still, like the air had thickened around us. I leaned forward slightly, trying to gauge his reaction. I wanted to ask him something, anything. But when I opened my mouth, the words felt stuck, like I couldn't breathe properly. I pulled my phone back up, trying to figure out how this was happening. How could I have been in the wrong car? Maybe the driver had switched his route or something. Maybe I had made a mistake. But then, I checked the ride details again. The car I was in was exactly the same as the one on the app. Same model, same make. But why didn't I get any notifications? Why hadn't I heard the usual "arriving now" sound? My stomach dropped. I could feel the sweat beginning to bead on my forehead. Suddenly, I decided to act. I didn't know what was going on, but I needed to get out of that car. I could feel a panic creeping up my spine, but I tried to keep it together. I glanced at the door handle and realized I had no idea if the door would even open from the inside. That thought made my anxiety spike. But I couldn't sit there quietly any longer. I cleared my throat, trying to sound calm. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice even. "Can you pull over? I think I've got the wrong car." There was no response. Nothing. I watched the back of his head for any sign that he had heard me. Still nothing. My breath came in shallow gasps. I was starting to feel claustrophobic, like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. My hands were shaking. I needed to get out of the car, but I wasn't sure how to make that happen. I swallowed hard and reached for the door handle again, pulling on it this time. The handle didn't budge. "Let me out," I said, trying not to raise my voice. I wasn't sure why I thought that would make a difference, but I was desperate. I looked around, trying to keep track of where we were. We had passed a few intersections, but I wasn't familiar with this part of town. I didn't recognize any of the street names on the signs we passed. Still, the car kept moving forward, as if there was no destination. "Let me out." My voice came out louder than I intended. But as soon as I spoke, the car jerked to a stop. The sudden change made my heart leap. The sound of the tires screeching on the pavement echoed in the silence. I froze. My hand was still gripping the door handle, but I was too scared to open it now. My stomach twisted into a knot. The driver hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't turned his head once. It was like he hadn't heard me at all. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a voice, a soft voice, barely a whisper. "Get out." I nearly jumped out of my seat. The words came from him. The driver. "Get out," he repeated, still not turning to face me. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I yanked on the handle, and this time, the door opened. I didn't care if it was in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't staying in that car another second. I got out, slamming the door behind me. I stood on the curb, staring at the car as it slowly pulled away. My hands were trembling, and my heart was racing. I looked at my phone again. The notification still said my real Uber was just arriving. It was only a block away. I watched the car drive off into the night, disappearing into the darkness, and then I quickly made my way to the real Uber that had just pulled up in front of me. The driver looked at me like he was confused but said nothing. I got in without saying a word, and when I finally sat down in the back seat, I felt like I could breathe again. The car was warm, the driver was normal, and for a second, everything felt like it was going to be okay. But when I checked my phone later that night, I saw something I couldn't explain. The ride details for the car I had just gotten out of were still active. The driver's name and car model were still listed. It wasn't just a glitch in the app, this had really happened. I'm not sure what that was, but I'll never be able to look at an Uber the same way again. And I don't think I'll ever forget that feeling, the feeling of not being able to escape, even though I was sitting in the right car. It was around midnight when I got the first call. I had just finished reading and was about to turn off the lights, but then my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, and for a moment, I hesitated. It wasn't unusual to get spam calls, but something about it felt off. Still, I answered, figuring I might as well just get it over with. "Hello?" I said, holding the phone up to my ear. There was silence on the other end. Nothing. Not even a breath. I waited for a few seconds, thinking maybe it was just a bad connection or one of those automated systems that's supposed to connect you to a person. But there was nothing. No clicking, no noise, just dead air. After what felt like forever, I finally hung up. It wasn't that strange. Like I said, spam calls are common. But something about the stillness of that silence bothered me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably nothing. I put my phone down on the bedside table and turned off the lamp. Just as I was settling into bed, the phone rang again. The same number. Same unfamiliar digits. I sighed. I wasn't going to answer it this time. But the ringing didn't stop. It just kept going and going. It was almost as if it was louder than usual, like the sound was pushing through the room, forcing me to hear it. I was getting irritated, but I wasn't about to let some random caller ruin my night. I grabbed my phone and, with a quick swipe, hit decline. But the phone didn't stop ringing. I stared at the screen. The same number, calling me again. I felt my stomach tighten. Maybe it was a prank, or someone just messing with me. It was late, so I tried to brush it off, but something about the constant ringing, the persistence of it, made my skin crawl. I wasn't used to being harassed like this. Usually, A single missed call would make whoever it was give up. This didn't feel normal. I debated what to do next. It was probably nothing, right? I thought about blocking the number, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. So, I let it ring. And ring. And ring. The sound was starting to get to me, like it was drilling into my head. Finally, I picked up the phone again. Hello? My voice was sharper this time, almost trembling. Nothing. Absolute silence. Just the eerie quiet on the other end of the line. I pulled the phone away from my ear and checked the screen again. I had this sick feeling in my stomach now, a feeling like something was wrong, like I wasn't just dealing with some annoying prank. I looked at the number, still no name, just those strange digits. I tapped the screen to hang up, but before I could press anything, the phone rang again. I don't know why I answered. Maybe I just wanted to get it over with. Hello? I said, more urgently this time, hoping to get some kind of response, anything to break the silence. But this time, I thought I heard something. A soft shuffle, like someone moving. The faintest sound, but it was there, just barely. It sent a chill down my spine. Hello? I asked again, louder this time. Who is this? The shuffle got louder, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then, the line cut off. The call ended abruptly. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before. I was breathing too fast, my heart beating hard in my chest. I dropped the phone onto my bed, trying to calm myself down. My mind raced. Was this a joke? Had someone been messing with me this whole time? I stood up, pacing around my room. I felt exposed, like there was something wrong. Like something was waiting. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't stop thinking about the phone call. It didn't make sense. Why would someone call and not say anything? And why had they called so many times in a row? I glanced over at the window. The blinds were closed, but a sliver of light from the street lamp outside leaked through, casting a faint glow on the floor. I walked over to the window, pulled back the blinds just enough to look outside. There, across the street, in the shadows, I saw a figure. A person standing in the dark, watching my house. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but I could tell they weren't moving. It was like they were standing still, just staring. My breath caught in my throat. I quickly pulled the blinds back down and stepped away from the window, my heart pounding. What was happening? I tried to make sense of it. The phone calls, the person standing outside. Was it just some coincidence? Was I overreacting? But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I felt like someone was standing right next to me, breathing down my neck. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was still the middle of the night, well after midnight. I wasn't sure what to do. I could call the police, but that seemed extreme. What would I even tell them? That someone called me in the middle of the night, and I thought I saw someone across the street? It sounded ridiculous even to me. I sat back down on my bed, trying to think logically, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But I kept looking at the window, unable to stop myself. Every time I glanced at it, my anxiety spiked. I felt like something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. It was then that I heard it again. The phone. Ringing. I jumped up and grabbed it, my hand shaking. I looked at the number, the same strange digits. For a moment, I just stared at it. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to hear that silence again. But I couldn't let it go unanswered. Not now. I hit the green button. Hello? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. Not even the shuffle I had heard earlier. Just dead silence. I waited, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. And then, suddenly, the silence broke. There was a noise, soft but unmistakable, a faint creak, like the sound of someone stepping on a floorboard. My heart stopped. I looked at the phone screen again. The call had ended, but my stomach was in knots. I couldn't stop shaking. I stood frozen, staring at the phone, and then, without thinking, I moved quickly toward the door, towards the front of the house. I had to check. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I peeked through the peephole in the door and looked outside. The figure was still there, standing in the same spot across the street. But now, I could see something else. The person had moved closer. They were standing just outside my gate, staring directly at my front door. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I run? I grabbed my phone again, this time dialing 911. I think someone is outside my house, I said when the operator answered. My voice was shaking. I keep getting these weird calls, and there's someone standing outside. I think they're watching me. The operator asked for my address, and I gave it to her, still trying to keep calm. She assured me help was on the way. I didn't take my eyes off the door the entire time I waited for the police to arrive. The person didn't move, just stood there, waiting. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually, I heard sirens. When the police got there, the person was gone. They searched the area but found no trace of anyone. I don't know who it was, or why they were calling me. But after that night, I never answered an anonymous call again. And I never felt safe in my own home for a long time after that. At first, I didn't know if I should say anything at all, but it's been on my mind for months, and I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong that night. It was one of those things that started off normal and then spiraled out of control in ways I never expected. It was late, sometime after midnight, and I had just gotten comfortable on my couch after a long day of work. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional car driving down the street. I live in a small neighborhood, mostly families and older couples, and while it's quiet, it's not exactly the kind of place where strange things happen. At least, I used to think that way. I was watching some dumb TV show, trying to wind down, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I wasn't paying much attention to it at first. My apartment has big windows, and sometimes you can see reflections in the glass of cars passing by, lights from other buildings, or the occasional stray cat wandering through. But this was different. The shadow I saw didn't move like anything I'd seen before. It was too still. Too deliberate. I turned my head, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing outside my window. At first, I thought it was my neighbor. I live on the second floor, so the window is high enough that I can see the street, but not so high that I can't get a good look at the building across from mine. It's the same block of apartments, and sometimes you see people standing near their windows, maybe looking out or just moving around. I didn't think much of it. But then something didn't feel right. The figure wasn't moving the way my neighbor usually did. For a moment, I just stared, squinting to get a better look. The figure wasn't as tall as my neighbor, and they didn't have the same kind of posture. There was no movement, not even a slight twitch. The figure was completely still, almost like a mannequin. I pushed myself off the couch and walked closer to the window, my heart starting to race for no good reason. I figured it was probably just someone standing still for a moment, waiting for something. But the closer I got, the more I felt like something wasn't adding up. When I reached the window, I looked out and saw it more clearly. The figure was standing right under the street lamp, its back to me, but I could see it clearly now. It wasn't wearing anything out of the ordinary, just a plain jacket and jeans, which made me think even more that it was just a neighbor or someone passing through. But then, as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The figure was much too still. I hadn't seen anyone stand like that, like they were frozen in place, not even moving their head. I felt a chill run through me. I wasn't sure what to do. I should have just turned away and gone back to the couch. It was probably nothing. But I couldn't look away. It felt like I was being drawn to it, like there was something about that stillness that kept pulling me in. I wasn't sure why, but I stood there, staring. And then it moved. Slowly, at first. The figure turned its head, just a little, almost imperceptibly, as though it had just realized it was being watched. I froze. My pulse quickened. I hadn't heard a footstep, hadn't seen any movement up to that point, but there it was, the figure's head turning slowly, with an eerie deliberation. The worst part was that the figure's eyes didn't look away from mine. It wasn't like a casual glance, or even a glance of curiosity. It was like it was locking onto me. I pulled back from the window, my back against the wall, heart hammering in my chest. I don't know what came over me, but I immediately felt like I needed to get away from the window. I didn't even take a breath before I backed into the living room and dropped onto the couch. I felt like I couldn't move, like I was frozen in place, my heart racing too fast for me to think clearly. I tried to shake it off. I thought maybe it was just some random person outside. Maybe they had been standing there without purpose. But then my mind started racing. Why had they been so still for so long? Why had they turned and looked at me so deliberately? It didn't sit right. I grabbed my phone and dialed my neighbor. He's an older guy, always friendly, and I figured maybe I could just ask if he had seen anyone standing out there. Maybe I wasn't the only one who had noticed it. But the phone just kept ringing. No answer. I texted him instead, hoping he'd pick up. Hey, just checking in. Everything okay out there? I saw someone standing near the street lamp and just wanted to make sure everything was fine. No reply. The minutes dragged by, each second feeling heavier than the last. I looked back out the window. The figure was still there. This time, they were standing closer to my building. The street lamp barely lit the figure, but I could see them more clearly now. Their face was still obscured, but I could tell that they weren't facing me directly. Their body was turned slightly to the side, but I could tell their head was still turned in my direction. I don't know why I did it, but I went to the window again, moving as quietly as I could. I wanted to see more. I needed to know if this was real. But when I peered outside, I could barely make out the figure's outline. They hadn't moved. Not an inch. Then, a thought crossed my mind that made me freeze. What if they were waiting for me to come out? What if this was more than just a random person standing there? What if they had been watching me the entire time? I backed away from the window again, this time pulling the blinds down quickly. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I needed to make sure I wasn't the next target, that I wasn't the one who had just been marked. I tried calling the police, but then I stopped myself. I didn't want to sound crazy. Who would believe that some random figure had been standing outside my window, staring at me for hours? I couldn't make sense of it myself. What did I even tell them? The feeling that had been growing in the pit of my stomach didn't go away. It just kept getting worse. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. I kept imagining that figure standing there, watching me, waiting for me to do something. I didn't feel safe. Finally, the sun started to rise. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I could tell that the sky was lightening. I couldn't see the figure anymore, and for the first time that night, I started to feel like I could breathe again. Maybe it had just been someone with no intention of scaring me, just standing there for some reason I couldn't understand. But even after I closed my eyes, even when I tried to forget about it, I couldn't. The thought of someone I had never seen before, standing outside my window for hours, watching me, stayed with me. I never saw that figure again, and after a while, I tried to convince myself it was just a weird incident. But part of me still wonders if that was the beginning of something, or if it was just a random encounter. What if they had been watching me for a while before I noticed? What if they're still out there, waiting? I haven't felt comfortable in my apartment ever since. It's been a while since I've been able to think clearly about what happened. I keep telling myself that it was just a misunderstanding, or maybe we were all just too tired and anxious to notice the signs. But deep down, I know something wasn't right. I don't know what it was or why it happened, but I don't think I'll ever be able to forget that night. It started off as any other evening. My boyfriend, Ethan, and I decided to invite one of our close friends, Ben, over for dinner. Ben and Ethan had been friends since college, and I'd gotten to know him over the years. He was a nice guy, quirky, a little awkward sometimes, but always well-meaning. We figured it would be a laid-back evening, good food, a few drinks, and catching up. We didn't make anything fancy, just some spaghetti and garlic bread. It wasn't a big deal, but we figured it'd be fun to have a meal together. Ben arrived around 7 p.m., just as we were finishing cooking. He brought a bottle of wine as a gift, which was nice. We set the table in the dining room and sat down to eat, laughing about some old memories. I don't know what it was that caught my attention first. Maybe it was the way Ben was sitting, or how he wasn't talking much. We had been joking around, and Ethan was telling some funny story about work, but Ben was just staring at his plate. It seemed strange, but I figured maybe he was tired, or maybe he wasn't in the mood to talk. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Ethan and I exchanged looks, both of us realizing that something was off. Ben hadn't touched his wine, and he hadn't even picked at his food. Usually, he was a pretty good eater, so this was unusual for him. I leaned over and said, "Ben, you okay?" He looked up at me slowly, his eyes almost blank, and then nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." His response didn't sound convincing at all. I felt a small knot in my stomach. Something about the way he said it was unsettling, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just tired, like I said. Ethan, trying to make light of it, asked, "You sure you're all right, man? You're kind of quiet tonight." Ben just nodded again, but this time, his face was blank, almost expressionless. He didn't respond to Ethan, and that's when I started to get uneasy. I looked over at Ethan, and he caught my eye, raising an eyebrow. Something wasn't right. I glanced back at Ben, and that's when I noticed something even stranger. There was a strange familiarity about his appearance, but it wasn't Ben. I mean, it looked like him, his hair, his clothes, even the way he sat. But there was something different. Something off. It was like I was looking at a version of him that I didn't recognize. His posture was stiff, his eyes unfocused. It was as if he was there, but not really there. "Ben?" I asked, trying to get his attention again. "Is everything okay?" This time, he didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes still distant, almost like he was somewhere else. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't like Ben. Not at all. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene. Maybe he was just in a mood or something. Maybe he had a bad day. So, I decided to try again. Ben, what's going on? You're acting weird. He blinked slowly, and then, in the softest voice, he said, I'm fine. But it didn't sound like him. It wasn't the usual warm tone that I was used to hearing from him. His voice sounded cold, almost hollow. I looked at Ethan, and I could tell he was getting uncomfortable too. His face was starting to shift from confusion to concern, and I could tell that he didn't know how to handle it either. There was another long pause, and then I decided I couldn't stay quiet any longer. I stood up from the table and took a step toward Ben. Who are you? I asked, my voice steady, though my heart was racing in my chest. Ben's eyes flicked up to me, and he blinked slowly again. My name is Ben, he said, but his tone was flat, almost robotic. My stomach dropped. No, I said, shaking my head. Who are you really? Ben didn't respond. He didn't even move. It was like he was waiting for something, or maybe he wasn't even aware of the conversation we were having. I glanced over at Ethan, and his face was pale. He stood up, looking at me with the same confused expression. I could feel the tension building in the room, like the air had thickened and everything was wrong. I wanted to get some answers, but I wasn't sure where to start. I felt like the person sitting at the table wasn't Ben. It was like the person across from me looked like him, sounded like him, but wasn't him at all. Ben, what the hell is going on? Ethan asked, his voice a little louder now. Why aren't you talking? The figure at the table didn't respond. He just sat there, unmoving. The silence between us stretched out like an eternity. I had a sinking feeling in my chest. Something wasn't right. Something was horribly wrong. I turned to Ethan, and we exchanged a look. Without saying a word, we both moved toward the door. We needed to get him out of here. We needed to do something. But the second I reached for the door handle, I turned around and saw him. Ben, or whoever it was standing. I froze. He hadn't moved from his seat since we started this dinner. How could he have gotten up without either of us hearing him? What do you want? I asked, my voice shaking. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel my palms sweating. The stranger's eyes met mine, but there was no recognition in them. No emotion. Nothing. His face was blank, and his lips were slightly parted as if he had been about to speak but changed his mind. His gaze was intense, almost cold. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't going to leave. Not unless we made him. Who are you? Ethan asked again, his voice shaking now too. I could see the same fear in his eyes that I was feeling. This wasn't Ben. It couldn't be. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us. And then, in the quietest voice, barely above a whisper, he finally said, I'm Ben. That was enough. Ethan stepped forward, and I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew we couldn't let this continue. I felt sick. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. We need to leave, I said, my voice firm now. We need to call the police. Ethan nodded, and we both started toward the door, moving quickly. We didn't look back. We didn't know what this person was or what they wanted, but we weren't going to stick around to find out. We left the apartment, and I locked the door behind us, never once taking my eyes off the window. The police arrived a little later. They checked the apartment thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No fingerprints, no evidence of a break-in. They told us it was possible we'd had a run-in with someone who looked like our friend. But I know what I saw, and I know what Ethan saw. There's no way that was Ben. I'm not sure who or what it was, but I can't forget it. And now, every time I hear someone knock on the door, my heart skips a beat. I just hope I never see that person again. I don't know why I took that elevator that day. I had the option of taking the stairs, but it had been a long day, and I was already exhausted. I work in a fairly large office building, one of those modern glass towers with 1,000 other businesses housed in it. I've worked there for almost a year, and I know most of the people who work in the building. So when I stepped into the elevator on the ground floor, I didn't think much of it at first. I just wanted to get home. The day had been like any other, nothing too out of the ordinary. I'd been sitting at my desk for most of the day, dealing with emails and phone calls, trying to get through the mountain of work that piled up. By the time I was done, I just wanted to go home, have a quiet evening, and forget about the stress of the day. It was almost 7 p.m. when I left my office and walked to the elevator bank. When I stepped inside, I didn't pay attention to who else was in the elevator. There was a man already inside, standing near the back. He was wearing a plain black jacket and dark jeans, not someone I recognized. He was looking at his phone, and I figured he was just another person from one of the other offices in the building. Nothing strange about that. I pressed the button for the ground floor, and the doors closed. It was about then that I started to feel uneasy. I don't know exactly why. It wasn't something I could put my finger on, just an overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. I glanced at the man, and he didn't seem to notice me at all. He was still staring at his phone, scrolling through it absently. The elevator moved, and everything seemed normal for the first few seconds. But then it happened. I noticed that he had started to inch closer to me. I told myself I was just imagining it, but it felt like with each passing second, he was taking small steps in my direction. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. I wasn't in any danger, at least, that's what I told myself, but the feeling of being cornered started to creep in. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The elevator began to slow down as it approached a floor, and I relaxed for a moment, thinking I could just step off at the next stop. But then the doors didn't open. The elevator continued to descend. I glanced at the display. It was showing that the elevator was still moving down, but the lights above the door indicated we were already at the floor. I didn't recognize it. The number was unfamiliar. I looked at the man again. This time, he wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was watching me. His eyes were locked onto me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. I should have said something. I should have screamed or hit the emergency button, but I didn't. I don't know why. I guess I was frozen, just staring back at him in silence. He didn't smile or frown. His expression was unreadable, just blank, like he was waiting for something. My heart began to race as the elevator came to a complete stop. I didn't hear any noise, no mechanical sound or the typical ding that indicates the doors are opening. It was just silence. The kind of silence that feels thick, almost oppressive. I couldn't even tell if we had stopped on the floor or if something was wrong. The air felt heavy. I reached for the button to open the door, but before I could press it, I noticed that the man had moved even closer. He was standing right next to me now. I could feel his presence so close that it made my skin crawl. I felt like I couldn't breathe. "What floor are you going to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. It was a weak attempt to break the tension, but my voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He didn't even move. It was like he hadn't heard me. His face was still impassive, and his eyes were fixed on mine, not in a way that was comforting or friendly. It was almost like he was trying to figure me out. The silence stretched on, and I could feel the panic beginning to rise in me. I pressed the button again, and the door didn't open. I pushed the emergency button. Nothing. I felt trapped. I turned to the man. I don't know why, but I was almost desperate. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking now. I could feel the heat of his body beside me, like he was getting closer with every second. Still, he didn't answer. But this time, his hand moved slowly, almost deliberately, toward the control panel. I stepped back, instinctively. He wasn't trying to push any button, but the way his fingers hovered above them made my heart race even faster. His fingers didn't move to press anything, but his whole body seemed to be blocking the controls. The elevator felt like it was closing in on me. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. I looked back at the door, desperate for it to open, but I knew it wasn't going to. I wasn't even sure where we were anymore. I'd never seen this floor before, and it wasn't one of the regular ones. I couldn't even tell if there was a way out. The man moved closer, and I could feel his breath on my neck. I froze. It wasn't even that he was touching me, it was the proximity, the fact that I was trapped with him, stuck in this tiny metal box with no way out. In a moment of panic, I pressed the emergency button again, harder this time. The elevator jolted slightly, and then, out of nowhere, the doors finally opened. I almost didn't wait for the doors to fully open before I bolted out of the elevator. I ran without even looking at where I was going, and I didn't stop until I reached the stairs. I didn't know where I was or how to get back to my floor, but all I could think about was getting away from him. I ran up the stairs, and when I finally made it to the main floor, I breathed a sigh of relief. I looked back at the elevator doors, half expecting him to be standing there, watching me, but he wasn't. I don't even know if he was real. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I had just worked myself up too much. But the fear was real, and I can still feel the lingering dread in my chest when I think about it. I never saw the man again. I don't know if he was a random person who had slipped into the building, or if something else was going on that I don't understand. But I'll never take that elevator again. And I'll never forget the feeling of being trapped, not knowing if I would ever make it out. It started when I moved into my new house. It was an old two-story place with a big backyard and a lot of potential. I had just gone through a tough breakup and needed a change of scenery, so I found this house on a quiet street and figured it was the right time to settle down somewhere new. The first couple of weeks were pretty uneventful, just the usual unpacking and getting used to the area. It wasn't until I met the neighbor across the street that things began to feel off. His name was Jake. I first saw him while I was out in the yard one afternoon, trimming the bushes. He stood in his front yard, just across the street from mine, staring at me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just curious about the new guy moving in. We waved at each other, but there was something strange about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up, studying me. He didn't smile or offer any friendly greeting, just a blank stare. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just one of those people who didn't say much. Over the next few days, I'd notice him standing outside more and more. Sometimes he'd be in his front yard, sometimes he'd be on the porch, but he was always facing my house, just standing there, staring at my windows. It didn't matter the time of day. If I looked outside, there he was. It was like he was waiting for something, or maybe even watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was paying way too much attention to me, even when I wasn't doing anything. One evening, after I got home from work, I pulled into my driveway and saw Jake standing by his mailbox, looking directly at my front door. I tried to ignore it, but it felt like something was off. It wasn't like he was just casually glancing. He was fixed on my house, unmoving. I stayed in my car for a few seconds, just to see if he would go inside, but he didn't. He just stood there, still as a statue. It made my skin crawl. I decided to go inside and leave him to whatever he was doing, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my stomach. I kept looking out the window, and sure enough, there he was, still standing by his mailbox, staring at my house. I couldn't understand why he was acting like this. Was he trying to be friendly? Or was there something else going on? It didn't stop there. Over the next week, his behavior escalated. I began noticing him standing outside my house at different times, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the late afternoon. He would just be standing there, motionless, staring at my windows. It was as if he knew exactly when I was home, and he would appear right at the moment I was inside. I began to feel like I was being hunted, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Then, one Saturday, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I left my house around noon and started walking down the street, not paying much attention to anything around me. When I reached the corner, I turned to walk toward the park. I looked over my shoulder, and there was Jake, walking a few steps behind me. It wasn't an accident, he was following me. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I kept walking, trying to figure out what to do. He stayed a few steps behind me, not getting any closer but never falling behind either. It was like he was making sure I knew he was there, but not in a way that made him obvious. It was unsettling, to say the least. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my heart start to race. What the hell was going on? I kept walking, trying to act normal, but inside I was freaking out. I turned onto the main street, hoping he would take a different route, but he didn't. He followed me, step by step, down the sidewalk, still just a few paces behind. At this point, I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to make a scene, but it was hard to ignore how strange this was. Finally, when I reached a coffee shop on the corner, I ducked inside, hoping he wouldn't notice. I stayed inside for a while, watching through the window. He stood across the street, just waiting, like he knew I was there. After a while, he walked off, disappearing around the corner. I didn't know if I was relieved or more terrified. It was like he was playing some kind of game with me, and I had no idea what the rules were. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I would look out my window, and there he would be, either standing in his yard or sitting in his car, just staring at my house. It wasn't just the random moments anymore. He was timing it, always showing up when I was at home. If I stepped out for a quick errand, I would come back and find him watching me from across the street, just waiting. I knew he wasn't just being neighborly. This was something else entirely. I tried calling the police one day, but when they arrived, they said they couldn't do anything unless he was directly threatening me. They told me to keep an eye on him and let them know if anything more serious happened. But that was the problem. It wasn't about direct threats. It was about the constant, unrelenting feeling that I was being watched. I had to take matters into my own hands. One night, I decided to drive around the block and see if I could catch him in the act. I left my house, taking a different route so he wouldn't see me. and then circled the block. When I turned back onto my street, I saw him. Jake was standing at the end of the driveway, staring up at my windows again. But this time, he wasn't alone. There was a man with him, someone I didn't recognize, standing right beside him. I parked a little further down the road, trying to stay out of sight. The two of them stood there, silent, watching my house. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know if I should confront him or just drive away and call the police again. But I didn't have much time to think. The man with Jake turned and walked away, and Jake stayed behind for a few moments before following him. It was my chance. I drove back to my house, keeping an eye out, and rushed inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't know what to do anymore. I felt like I was losing control, and I was terrified that it was going to escalate even further. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't feel safe there anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, lurking in the background. Even though I haven't seen Jake since I left, I still can't shake the feeling that he's watching me somehow. Every time I drive down a street or pass an unfamiliar face, I can't help but wonder if it's him. It was a regular Thursday evening, or at least I thought it was. I just finished up a late shift at work and was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to unwind. I'd recently moved into a new apartment in a part of the city I didn't know too well, so most of my nights were quiet. The occasional sirens, the hum of traffic in the distance, but nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to make me feel uncomfortable or unsafe. At least not until that night. I don't remember the exact time, but it was late, probably around midnight. I had just opened a bottle of water when my phone buzzed. A new message. The number was unfamiliar. I didn't recognize the area code, but that's not uncommon these days with all the spam and telemarketers. I figured it was some random sales pitch or a scam. The message was short. Just a sentence, "I know where you are." I froze. I didn't think much about it at first. It could have been anyone, but it felt odd. I didn't know why, but something about the message made me uneasy. I looked at it for a second longer than I should have, my mind racing. Was it a joke? Someone messing with me? Or maybe a mistake? I wasn't sure, but I figured it was harmless. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I got up and checked the locks on my front door and the balcony door. I didn't feel any safer, but it helped a little just to know everything was secured. I walked back to the couch and sat down, looking out the window at the empty street below. The city lights flickered in the distance, the only movement coming from a lone car driving by. The apartment complex was quiet. Everything seemed normal. I was about to put my phone down when it buzzed again. Look outside. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know why, but I had this sinking feeling in my stomach. I was no longer just confused. I was scared. I looked at the message again. I didn't know what to do. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the window, trying to tell myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. Maybe it was a prank from someone at work or a scam, or maybe someone got the wrong number. But the text didn't sit right. I couldn't shake the sense of dread that was starting to creep in. I pulled the blinds back slowly, my hand shaking just a little. The street below was still quiet, with no one around. My eyes scanned the sidewalk, the parking lot across the street, the corner where the street lamp flickered. There was nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe I had been overreacting. I let the blinds go and turned to sit back down, but then I stopped. I don't know what made me look back, but I did. And that's when I saw him. Standing at the edge of the parking lot, right near the entrance to the building, was a man. At first, I thought it was just someone walking by, but then I realized he was staring at my apartment. Not just in the general direction, but directly at my window. His face wasn't clearly visible, but his figure was outlined by the dim light from the street lamp. He stood still, unmoving, his body almost rigid as he gazed at my window. I couldn't breathe for a second. My pulse shot up. What the hell? How long had he been standing there? I hadn't noticed him until just now. I couldn't make out any details of his appearance, but he was definitely there, watching. I felt like I was suffocating. I tried to tell myself that maybe it was someone else, that maybe he was just lost or waiting for someone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't supposed to be there. I wanted to call the police, but I couldn't move. I couldn't stop looking at him, even though I wanted to turn away. I felt like if I took my eyes off him for a second, something worse would happen. I don't know what I thought he would do, break in, come up to my apartment. But the thought of someone watching me like that, standing still in the dark, filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. I'd never felt that helpless before. I checked the message again, the same one that had sent me into a panic. Look outside. I was frozen. The feeling of being trapped in my own apartment was overwhelming. I took a step back from the window, still not able to stop looking. I grabbed my phone and, with shaky hands, I dialed the police. I couldn't even speak at first, my throat was tight. But when the operator answered, I forced out the words. There's someone outside my apartment. I think he's watching me. She asked for my address, my details, and I gave them to her, but I still couldn't stop watching. The man didn't move. He just stood there, motionless. It felt like hours, but I knew it had only been a few minutes. The world outside was dark and still, and the only movement I could see was him standing there, watching. Then something else happened. He started to move. It wasn't a fast movement, but he turned slightly, just enough to show his face under the dim light. And when he did, I swear I saw a smirk. A twisted, sickening grin, like he knew something I didn't. That's when I almost lost it. I couldn't stand it anymore. I backed away from the window, feeling dizzy, my hands cold, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. I bolted for the front door to check if it was locked again, my heart pounding, but I couldn't take my eyes off the window. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't leave. Not with him standing there, not with the feeling that he was waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't wait any longer. I called the police again and told them that he was still outside, and I couldn't see him clearly. I didn't know if he was alone or if there were more people. I just knew that I had to do something. When they arrived, the man was gone. I couldn't believe it. There were no signs of him anywhere, no footprints or any trace of him being there. The police checked the area, but they didn't find anything. No one in the building had seen anyone suspicious, and when I looked down from my window, everything looked calm and quiet, like it always had. I almost thought I imagined it all, but the texts kept coming. I know where you are. Look outside. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. The police said they couldn't do much without more evidence, but I knew something wasn't right. It's been a few days now, and I haven't seen him again, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching. Every time I walk past the window, I expect to see him standing there again, that smirk on his face. I don't know if it's over, or if it's just the beginning. I'm scared to stay here, but I'm even more scared to leave. I can't shake the feeling that whoever it was knows everything about me. I don't know why they chose me. I don't know what they want. but I know I'm not safe. It was a Friday night, or maybe it was technically Saturday morning. I don't remember exactly, but it was late, and I had just finished a long day at work. I was tired, my eyes were heavy, and I just wanted to get home. I live out in the suburbs, so the drive is long and mostly empty roads, with a few streetlights scattered every couple of miles. There's not much out there, just the occasional farm, some trees, and open fields. It's peaceful, but in a way, that kind of quietness makes you feel like you're the only one on earth sometimes. I was driving along, not paying too much attention, just listening to music and trying to keep myself awake. I've driven this road 100 times, so I knew it well. That's probably why I didn't notice him at first. I was nearing the last stretch of the drive when I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. I wasn't in any hurry, but I noticed the car behind me wasn't passing. They were just sitting there, close, too close for comfort. I thought maybe they were just taking the same turn as me, but something about the way they stayed behind me made my stomach drop. The car had been following me for a good while now, and I hadn't thought too much about it at first. But when the headlights blinked, I realized it was a cop car. The flashing lights were unmistakable. I had no reason to worry, I thought, but I still felt a little uneasy. Maybe it was just the time of night, or maybe it was because I'd never seen another car on this stretch of road at this time. I pulled over, like you're supposed to do when a cop pulls behind you, and I just sat there for a second, waiting. The only sound was the low hum of my engine and the flicker of the police lights in the rearview mirror. The officer got out of his car slowly. I could see him now, walking toward my window. At first, he seemed normal enough, tall, maybe a little too tall, but still, just a man in a uniform. But then I noticed something strange. His uniform wasn't like any cop uniform I had seen before. It was dark, but it wasn't the usual blue or black. The material looked off, almost too shiny, like it was made of some kind of synthetic fabric. His badge was hard to make out in the low light, but I could swear it was blurry, like it wasn't even real. He reached my window, and I couldn't help but feel a pit form in my stomach. His face was pale, almost too pale, and his eyes, they were wide, too wide, like he was looking at me in a way that didn't feel right. He had this blank expression on his face, not even a hint of warmth, no normal "how's it going" that you'd get from a regular cop. No small talk. No friendly tone. Just nothing. I rolled down my window a little, just enough so I could hear him. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his voice low, too low, like he wasn't really speaking to me but more like he was saying it to himself. I shook my head, feeling the tension creep up my neck. "No, officer, I don't," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a long moment, his face not changing. Then, he slowly leaned forward, just enough so that I could smell something faintly sour coming off of him. It made me feel even more on edge. "I'm going to need to see your ID and registration," he said, and his voice sounded almost mechanical, like he was reading from a script. I reached into the glove compartment for my registration and my wallet. My hands were trembling now, and I was doing everything I could to stay calm. I handed him the papers, but when I looked up at him, I realized he wasn't looking at them. He was just standing there, staring at me with those wide eyes. He didn't even blink. My skin prickled with the sudden need to leave. Something was wrong. This wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but I had this horrible feeling that I needed to get away, now. I pulled my hand back from the door handle and looked at him again. "Is something wrong, officer?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. There was a pause before he finally spoke again. "No," he said, almost too quickly. "Everything's fine. Just stay put." The words didn't sound right coming from him. They didn't feel like words anyone would say in a situation like this. It wasn't like he was trying to help me. It was more like he was trying to control me, to make me stay still. I couldn't take it anymore. I started to slowly roll the window back up, but before I could, he reached forward, his hand gripping the top of the door with surprising force. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. He didn't even flinch. Just held onto it, his fingers like they were glued to the metal. That's when I knew I had to leave. Fast. I didn't say anything else. I threw the car in gear, slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, and sped off. The tires screeched against the asphalt as I shot down the road, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. All I could think was that I had to get out of there, away from that man. I drove like that for a while, my hands tight on the wheel, my mind racing, but the further I went, the more I realized something. The flashing lights were still behind me. I could see the faint glow in the mirror, just enough to make me feel like I was being hunted. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't let him catch up. I made a sharp turn down a side street, and then another, taking the turns faster than I should have. The whole time, the car stayed right behind me, staying too close, the lights still flashing. My breath was shallow, my head spinning. I didn't dare look back again, but I could feel him there, always there. After what felt like an eternity of driving, I finally reached a more populated part of town. I pulled into a well-lit gas station, slammed the car in park, and jumped out of the car, my legs shaking. I could barely catch my breath. The cop car hadn't followed me into the station. There were no flashing lights anymore. Nothing. I stood there for a second, trying to calm myself down, trying to convince myself it was over. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd imagined things. But I couldn't forget the way he looked at me. The way he stood too still, too cold. I called 911 and explained what happened. They told me to stay at the gas station until an officer could get there. When they arrived, they asked me to describe the car, but I couldn't give them a solid description. All I could remember was the lights, the weird uniform, and his eyes. They told me they'd check around, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. They assured me I was safe now, but I knew something wasn't right. I never saw that cop or whatever he was again. But I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some mix-up or random situation. I know it wasn't just my imagination. It was something else. Something wrong. I still don't drive that stretch of road at night, and whenever I do, I keep my eyes on every car that comes up behind me. I can't help but wonder if that man is still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person to drive by. I've been driving for Uber for a little over a year now. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and most of the time, it's just like any other job. You pick people up, drop them off, maybe have a quick chat if they're in the mood for it, and move on to the next fare. Simple. It was a Saturday night when it happened. The usual crowd on weekends, people heading home from bars, night shifts, a few heading to parties. The city was quiet, the streets well lit under the hum of streetlights. My shift was almost over, but there was one last fare that popped up just as I was about to head home. I didn't think much of it. The pickup was only a few blocks away, so I figured I'd grab this last ride, drop them off, and then go straight to bed. I arrived at the address, a tall building with one of those buzzer systems, and waited for the passenger to come down. It wasn't until I saw him stepping out of the door that I started to get a weird feeling, but I didn't think too much of it at first. The guy wasn't anything special. He was tall, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, the kind of outfit you don't really notice unless you're looking. His face was a little pale, and there was something off about the way he moved, like he wasn't quite fully present, if that makes sense. I didn't think about it too much. People are weird, I figured, so I just did my usual thing and opened the door for him. "Hey, man, where to?" I asked as he climbed into the back seat. He didn't answer immediately. Just sat there for a second, staring at the seat in front of him, like he was thinking about something. I need to go to 52nd Street, he finally said, in a voice that was quiet, almost too quiet, like he didn't really want to be talking. I nodded and started the car, turning onto the main road, setting the GPS. For a few minutes, everything seemed normal. The usual ride. I had much worse customers before, drunk people yelling, talking about their exes, weird conversations, but this guy was different. There was something about him that made me uneasy, even though he hadn't said much yet. His eyes kept flicking to the side, like he was watching the street signs, but then, out of nowhere, he spoke again. "Take the next left," he said, his voice sharp, like he had been holding it in. I glanced at the GPS, and it didn't line up with the route I'd been given. No, I think it's better to stay on this road. It'll be quicker." He didn't say anything for a second, just kept staring out the window. Then he repeated himself, but this time, his voice was a little more urgent. "No, take the left. It's quicker this way." Now I was starting to feel even more uncomfortable. I'd been driving this city for a while, and I knew the roads well. There was no reason to take a detour, especially not at night when things felt quieter than usual. But something about the way he said it made me hesitate. I didn't want to start an argument or deal with a guy who might get hostile, so I decided to just take the turn. I figured, maybe he knew something I didn't. I took the left, the road getting narrower the further we went. It was a part of the city I didn't usually drive through, and now I started noticing the houses getting more spaced out, fewer streetlights. It was one of those areas where the roads weren't as well maintained, and the houses looked a little older, more run down. My headlights flickered as I drove, casting shadows that made the whole scene feel more surreal. The guy didn't say a word as we drove. He was just sitting there, watching the street, like he was expecting something. I started to feel that familiar knot in my stomach, the one that tells you something's off, but you don't know what exactly. After another few minutes, I turned to ask him if he was sure this was the right way, just to make sure I hadn't missed something. But when I looked back at the rearview mirror, the seat was empty. My heart dropped into my stomach. I thought maybe he'd just moved to the other side of the seat, or maybe he'd leaned down to tie his shoes or something. But no! The back seat was completely empty. Not a single sound. Not even the seatbelt was undone. I felt my pulse start to race. I slowed down and looked in the rearview mirror again, just to double check, but there was nothing. No sign of him. For a second, I thought maybe he'd just gotten out and I hadn't seen him. But no! I hadn't heard the door open, and the car had been moving the whole time. I reached up to check the door lock, still locked. I checked the back seat again, just to be sure. Nothing. It felt like I had just entered some kind of weird, empty space. Like everything had gone still. The air felt thicker somehow, and I was left there alone, in the middle of nowhere. No sound except for the low hum of the engine. I don't even know how long I just sat there, staring at the empty back seat, my mind running in circles. Eventually, I turned the car around. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just stay there. It was dark, it was quiet, and the weird feeling that had settled in my chest was only growing stronger. I drove back the way I came, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he had just gotten out for a second without me noticing. But I couldn't explain the way I hadn't heard the door open, the way the seat had stayed perfectly still as if he hadn't even moved. I drove back to the main road, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see him sitting there again, but there was nothing. Just empty seats. I stayed on the main roads, kept driving until I was back into more familiar parts of the city. When I finally got back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just experienced something I couldn't explain. That guy hadn't been normal. It was like he had just disappeared, and I couldn't make sense of it. I had passengers leave before, but never like that. Never with no sign, no sound. I didn't report it. I didn't know what I would even say. I didn't have any proof, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what had just happened. I haven't had any strange fares since, but every time I pick someone up at night now, I can't help but glance at the rearview mirror, just to make sure no one's sitting back there. I never thought working late at the office would be anything more than a boring, quiet task. It wasn't unusual for me to stay after hours when things piled up, especially when the deadline was approaching. The office was small, just a few rooms, and the lights were always the same, flickering every now and then. The hum of the computers and the occasional murmur of the HVAC system were the only sounds. It was just another Thursday night. I was finishing up some reports at my desk when the phone rang. The office phone. I remember glancing at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. I'd been there since 6:30. I was exhausted, but the work needed to be done. I reached for the receiver, thinking it was just another colleague calling to check if I was still there. Maybe they wanted to drop off something, or even just chat about their day. I didn't expect it to be a stranger. "Hello?" I answered, rubbing my eyes. There was a brief silence on the other end before a voice, low and somewhat raspy, came through. It wasn't familiar, but it sounded calm. Almost too calm. "Are you alone?" the voice asked. I paused. It was a strange question. It wasn't something anyone had ever asked me before, at least not over the phone. I looked around the room. The office was dark except for the faint glow of my desk lamp. The building was quiet. I knew I was the only one still there. "Yes," I said, a little unsure of why I was even answering. "I'm alone." There was another long pause, just enough for me to feel the weight of the silence. My heart beat a little faster now. Something about the way the question had been asked, too simple, too pointed, felt wrong. "I'm here," the voice said. I froze. The blood in my veins seemed to stop. My fingers went cold around the receiver. I looked up from my desk, my eyes scanning the room. The flickering of the overhead lights seemed to get worse all of a sudden, casting odd shadows along the walls. There was no sound. No footsteps, no movement, no sign that anyone else was there. I wasn't sure what to do. I wanted to tell the person on the other end of the line to go away, but something stopped me. My heart hammered in my chest, but my mouth went dry. I didn't know if I should hang up or say something, but I couldn't bring myself to do either. It was like the air had thickened, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of every little detail around me. The phone line crackled slightly, and then I heard the voice again, this time with a soft chuckle. "You can look, but I'm here." The voice sounded closer, like it was right there beside me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly turned my head to the side, scanning the room again, but there was no one. Just my desk, my computer, and the empty chairs scattered around. The door to the hallway was open, the dark corridor outside seeming endless. I could see the light in the stairwell flickering faintly from where I was sitting. But still, no one. "I'm alone," I repeated, though this time it was more of a whisper, more for reassurance than anything. "There's no one here." The voice on the other end didn't reply immediately. There was just a faint rustling, like static. I felt my grip tighten on the phone, almost unwilling to let it go. Every instinct in my body was telling me to hang up, but I couldn't. It was as if something was keeping me tethered to that conversation, even though it was completely irrational. I heard another soft laugh, then the voice again, "I know you're there." I had to fight the urge to jump up and bolt out of the room. But something told me not to make sudden movements. I didn't want to draw attention, whatever that meant. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but my mind was running wild with every possible scenario. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. I was shaking now, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the receiver. There was no answer at first. Just silence. Then I heard a faint click, like someone had dropped something heavy onto the floor. "I'm watching you," the voice said, the words slow and deliberate. I couldn't breathe. I wasn't even sure if I had enough air in my lungs to scream, but I knew one thing, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. I shot up from my desk, the chair scraping loudly across the floor as I backed away, my eyes darting around. I checked the hallway again. No one. The hallway was still empty. But there was something about the way the light flickered that made me feel like it was closing in on me. I felt cornered, like there was no way out. Then the phone crackled once more. "I'm here," the voice repeated, only this time it was more intense, like it was right beside me. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like someone was in the room with me now. I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to leave. The phone felt heavy in my hand, like a burden. My feet moved before I even had time to think, but I was paralyzed by the sensation that someone was watching me. The office door. I needed to get to the office door. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadows around the room as I walked toward it, not daring to look behind me. I fumbled for the doorknob and yanked it open. The hallway seemed impossibly long as I rushed down it, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own footsteps echoing in my ears. I didn't stop to check the phone again. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of the building. The elevator doors were open, waiting for me. I hit the button to the ground floor, my heart racing, my hands slick with sweat. The elevator moved slowly, creaking and groaning as it descended. It felt like forever before the doors opened to the ground floor. I bolted out of the building without a second thought, not caring that I had left everything behind: the reports, my keys, my bag. I just wanted to be out, in the open, away from that building. I'm not sure when I realized it, but I hadn't heard that voice again. Not since I ran. Since then, I've never worked late at the office again. No matter what. Even though it was the middle of the day, even though it was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling of someone watching me, waiting for me to be alone again. The lights flicker every now and then when I pass by the office, and sometimes I swear I hear the phone ring. But I'll never pick it up again.